Linda O'Keefe was born on May 24, 1962, in Newport Beach, California, USA. She grew up in a large and close-knit family. Her father was a machinist and her mother was a seamstress. Linda had two sisters, an older sister and a younger sister. Linda was fond of drawing, played the piano, and loved nature and animals very much. On warm summer days, she did not miss any opportunity to go out to the beach, which was only 800 meters from her home. The girl was also a Girl Scout and attended summer school. In July 1973, when Linda was 11, she went there almost every day. Usually, she rode her bicycle to school. But on the morning of July 6th, a piano teacher who lived a few houses away from the O'Keefe family agreed to give her a ride. After class ended at about 1:30, Linda used the school phone to call her mother. She asked to be picked up because she was without her bicycle that day. But the woman was working at home at the time and didn't want to be distracted, so she told her daughter to walk. Even though it was only a little over 2 kilometers from school to home, Linda didn't want to walk. After talking to her mother, she even cried, and the school secretary thought about giving her a ride home. But the woman needed to go the other way, so she gave up the idea. Linda came out of the school, sat outside the building for a while, and headed toward home. Her route should have taken no more than half an hour, but the girl was clearly delayed. At first, her mother did not think much of it. She thought Linda had met her friends and gone for a walk. But with each passing hour, she became more and more worried. By 6 p.m., her mother decided to call everyone she knew whose children lived nearby and might have gone out with their daughter, but none of them had seen Linda that day. When her father returned from work, the family decided to go looking. They drove all over the neighborhood, including the route Linda was supposed to take back from school. At that point, the parents assumed the girl had resented her mother for refusing to pick her up and was deliberately not going home. But when they still could not find her and it began to get dark outside, they decided to go to the police. Officers took a missing girl report and began their search. Meanwhile, her father and older sister went out again to comb the neighborhood in 2 cars, while her mother stayed home, calling dozens of people who at least, with the slightest chance, could see Linda. The search continued throughout the night. Police searched the streets and parks using search dogs and helicopters, but it was inconclusive. By morning, the police department had dispatched more officers to join the search, and local newspapers were already reporting on the massive operation involving the disappearance of the 11-year-old girl. At about 10:30 a.m., a bicyclist and her friend and son were riding through a park that was 9 kilometers from Linda's house. They headed there to observe the local fauna for the botanical circle. Father and child dismounted and headed toward the ditches to see frogs, but something else awaited them there. Noticing something light in the grass, the man walked closer and saw there a human body, partially covered by water. In the morning paper, he had read about the disappearance of a girl who had been searched for all night by the police, so he immediately thought that the body belonged to her. In the next few minutes, the man and his friends ran out of the park, got into their cars, and rushed to find the nearest payphone to report their find. On the way, they encountered an officer who had been part of the search for Linda. Upon hearing their story, the police officer reported it and headed toward the location. The investigators instantly realized that the deceased was Linda O'Keefe. She was wearing the same clothes the girl had left for school, and her backpack was lying next to her. This, as well as the white dress worn by the girl, had been made for her by her mother. She was not wearing shoes, however, and they were never found near the body. Detectives proceeded to examine the crime scene. They found tire tracks on the ground near where the body was found, but no other clues. Medical examiners determined that strangulation was the cause of death. They determined that the death occurred between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Investigators understood that Linda had most likely been abducted shortly after she left school, which meant that the perpetrator had held her somewhere for about 12 hours. The victim was also abused, and experts found traces of DNA on her body. They were given to the laboratory for safekeeping since DNA analysis had not yet been performed in those years. With no serious leads on hand, the detectives set about looking for witnesses. They interviewed all of Linda's friends, school employees, and residents of the streets where the girl was supposed to walk home. Soon, it bore fruit. On her way home from school, the girl was seen by her friend, who noticed something strange. Linda was walking along the road, and at some point, a turquoise van approached her. He slowed down and continued to drive next to the girl, but her friend did not see further events because Linda and the van disappeared from her field of vision. Almost immediately, police were able to find two more witnesses. The 19-year-old girl and her mother were driving a car about 100 yards from Linda's school. At one point, they noticed the girl talking to the driver of the turquoise van, who had stopped next to her. It was about 1:15 p.m. The witnesses lived near the O'Keefe family and were well acquainted with them, so they were very surprised that Linda was talking to some adult male on the street and decided to watch what was going on. The passenger door of the van was open, and Linda was standing right in front of it. Apparently, she was talking to the driver, and at some point, the girl got into the car. Immediately afterwards, the van drove away, and the witnesses decided not to pay much attention to it. They thought that Linda had been picked up by a relative or acquaintance because they were sure that the girl would not get into a car with a stranger. After questioning the girl and her mother, investigators got a rough description of the driver. He was a white man between the ages of 24 and 30, with blonde curly hair and an elongated face. Unfortunately, the woman could not remember the license plate number or even the make of the car. Despite this, the story of the two women was the only solid lead in the case, so investigators put together an APB on the suspect and his car, based on the words of these witnesses. They were sent out all over California, but it was fruitless. The detective spoke with the woman a few more times, hoping they might be able to recall some additional details. At one point, they were even offered a hypnosis session, and they agreed. It only partially worked. The witnesses recalled a few additional facts about the suspect's car, but they were all too insignificant to help find the killer. Soon, the police were able to find another witness. A woman who lived near where Linda's body was found heard a woman screaming at about 10:30 p.m. She thought she heard someone yell, "Stop hurting me," but that voice cut off abruptly. Given that the girl died around the same time, the witness could have heard it. The detectives then received another interesting tip. On the morning Linda's body was discovered, the artist was painting a picture in that very park. Noticing dozens of police cars, he began to observe what was going on and realized that something serious had happened. At one point, he saw something that struck him as odd. Beside the police, there was a young man in the park, watching from the bushes. He was standing quite close to him, and the artist decided to ask him what was going on. The young man looked extremely worried and said that the police had found the girl's body, except that the man and the artist were standing far enough away from where the body was found and could not see any details. The detectives had a logical question as to how the man knew that it was the girl's body they had found. The artist described the man as a thin, white male between 18 and 24 years old, about 180 centimeters tall, with blonde hair and sideburns. This was close enough to what the two witnesses told police when describing the appearance of the van driver. As a result, investigators concluded that this man was the killer, that he had decided to watch the police that morning. Although the police had a fairly detailed description of the killer's appearance, finding him in the big city was quite problematic. 2 days later, however, something unexpected happened. Peter Wooten, 18, came to them and confessed to the murder. The young man lived near the O'Keefe family and was in the same class as the victim's older sister, Cindy. The news instantly spread through the town, shocking the residents. Police officers, who did not expect such a turn of events, questioned the boy for 7 hours and also searched his parents' home where he lived. After that, he was formally charged with murder. 3 days later, another unexpected twist awaited everyone. Investigators announced that Peter had been cleared of all charges and released. According to them, there were too many inaccuracies in the young man's confession, and the only coincidences in his story intersected with information that had appeared in the newspapers. Otherwise, he gave investigators knowingly false testimony, which contradicted the real evidence. Lastly, the 2 witnesses who had seen Linda with the van driver stated with absolute certainty that it was not Peter. They were both acquainted with the young man because they lived near him, so the women would immediately recognize him. As a result, the police concluded that the young man was simply trying to draw attention to himself by confessing to someone else's crime. Maybe the guy had some kind of mental problems, but he had nothing to do with the murder. After that, the detectives weren't left with a single solid lead. They kept looking for the van and its driver, combing the entire town. Even Linda's classmates participated in the search, despite protests from the police. Kids rode their bikes through the streets trying to find that same turquoise van, but all of that yielded no results. In the first month of the investigation, police questioned 175 people, combed every millimeter of the path from school to home, and asked the public for help. A few weeks later, they decided to release a rough sketch of the van's driver, but that also yielded no results. Initially, detectives were reluctant to do so because they feared the man might flee town, but every day they had to use more and more tools to solve the case. 2 months later, the police had a new lead. Another girl had been abused in the same neighborhood. An unidentified man had dragged her into his van, taken her to a deserted place, and after what he had done, let her go. Investigators immediately speculated that Linda's killer might be behind the crime, but there were inconsistencies. The assailant drove a white van, and description of his appearance did not match the data provided by the witnesses in Linda's case. Soon, the detectives were able to get a lead on the suspect. It turned out to be a 32-year-old trucker, and his guilt was proven. Witnesses said that he did not look at all like the man Linda was talking to, and the investigators concluded that this man had nothing to do with her murder. Since then, no significant evidence has emerged in the case, though detectives continue to work on it over the ensuing years. In 2001, 28 years after the murder, police sent DNA samples from Linda's body to a lab so they could extract a profile of the killer's DNA. They succeeded, but the man was not in the FBI database. This indicated that the killer had not been prosecuted in other criminal cases, or it was before the time when they started taking DNA from criminals. A few years later, experts tried to find his next of kin in that database, but failed again. However, in those years, it was almost impossible to do something like that because the tools of DNA analysis were far from what we have today. A breakthrough in this field of forensics around the middle of 2010, and the police had a new ability to find suspects. Investigators in Linda's case weren't left out either, and in 2018, they turned to a private lab called Parabon. Detectives received from them a portrait of a man based on the DNA of Linda's killer. This innovative technology, called DNA phenotyping, allows you to know different traits of a person's appearance with just a sample of their DNA. Specialists compiled 2 portraits at once, showing what the perpetrator might have looked like at the age of 20 and 60. Surprisingly, this portrait was very close to the accounts of witnesses who saw the suspect alive 45 years ago. Usually, in cases like this, police published portraits in the media to draw public attention and reach out to those who may have known the man. But investigators in Linda's case did something no one had tried before them. On July 6, 2018, Exactly 45 years after the murder, they posted a series of messages on Twitter on behalf of the victim herself. The series of 68 messages described the last day of Linda's life. The detectives presented this information as if she herself were telling the world what happened to her on July 6, 1973. The narrative began in the morning with Linda recounting her day at school, her resentment at her mother for not picking her up in the car, and the girl's journey home on foot. All of the facts from these messages were carefully selected by detectives to paint the most accurate picture possible of the day. The series of tweets ends with the fact that the search for her killer has so far been unsuccessful, at which point the police have published a portrait of the perpetrator on behalf of the girl. Now, 45 years later, I can speak again, and there is something important I have to tell you. There is a new lead in my case, a face obtained thanks to the DNA of the killer, which he left behind. This technology didn't exist in 1973, but now it can change everything. This approach instantly brought Linda's case to the attention of a huge number of people around the world. Police officers had shared information on old, unsolved cases on social media before, but a narrative from the victim herself was something new. The portrait of the killer himself was useless. It could only help solve the case if someone recognized the person and told the police. So the investigators needed to draw as much attention to these pictures as possible, and they did a great job. In total, more than 7 million people saw the series of tweets. The police received many tips and possible identities of the perpetrator, and detectives spent several months checking them out, but they were never able to find a suitable suspect. In spite of this, they were not going to give up, especially after millions of people were interested in Linda's case. The investigators again turned to Parabon, and this time, they asked them to try to find the killer's relatives through his DNA, something similar forensic scientists had already tried to do in the early 2000s. But back then, the necessary tools simply didn't exist. Almost 20 years later, the situation has changed. Parabon's experts were successfully finding people related to the owner of the DNA, and with this information, investigators could find the perpetrator. Work on finding Linda's killer began in August 2018. It took experts almost 6 months to get the first results. Using private DNA databases, they were able to find the killer's third cousin. For detectives, that effectively meant they were one step away from solving the case. All they had to do was research the man's family tree and come up with a suspect. But the experts at Parabon kept digging deeper, and soon they had an unexpected discovery. They found the killer's own DNA in one of the private databases. He had voluntarily uploaded his sample to a database that allows them to search for lost or distant relatives. As it turned out later, someone in his family had given the man the special genetic kit he needed to get into the database. 45 years later, police finally had a name of the killer: James Allen Neal. The man, who was 72 at the time, lived in another state, and in January 2019, detectives went to see him. Before they could arrest the suspect, they needed to get a sample of his DNA because a private database wouldn't have the weight the court needed. On January 29th, police set up surveillance on Neal's house and arranged with a garbage service to hand them anything the suspect threw out. After obtaining several items from which experts could take a sample of his DNA, investigators sent them to the lab and then continued to monitor James for the next 3 days. Unfortunately, forensics was unable to get a sample of the man's DNA, so the detectives needed to find something else. They soon had that opportunity. They observed the suspect as he sat in his car in the parking lot smoking. He then threw the cigarette butt on the pavement and drove away, and the police immediately picked up the evidence. This time, experts were able to extract a DNA sample, and it matched the DNA of the killer found on Linda's body exactly. This meant that it was James Neal who was the very perpetrator they had been searching for almost half a century. A few days later, detectives organized a press conference at which they finally announced the arrest of the suspect. James Neal was born in 1946 in Chicago, after which his family moved to California. His parents often beat and humiliated him and subjected him to violence, which caused him to behave aggressively from an early age. As a teenager, he committed various petty offenses, including breaking into other people's houses. After that, he dropped out of school and tried to get a job, but he never stayed in one place for more than a few months. It turned out that the man had an extensive criminal history. He was arrested more than 12 times for crimes of varying severity: theft, car theft, robbery, but almost every time he got off with minimal punishment, and then went back to his old ways. At the age of 25, James married for the first time, and the couple settled in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Their home was a half-hour drive from the city where Linda lived, and 2 years after moving in, he killed her. James' wife was pregnant at the time, and the perpetrator himself was on probation for less serious crimes in another state. After that, he was cited several more times for theft and counterfeiting bank checks, and he also spent a short stint in prison for violating the terms of his probation. Upon his release from prison, James was caught by the police 3 more times for traffic violations. He divorced his first wife, with whom they had 2 daughters. He lived in different states for a while, but then returned to Colorado and married another woman in 1997. She had a child from her first marriage, and soon she and James had a daughter. After examining his background in more detail, detectives found that the man may have been involved in dozens of cases of child abuse, but he was never held accountable for what he had done. In 1995 and in 2004, Neal kidnapped 2 girls by driving up to them in his car. He abused them and then released them. In both cases, he was never proven guilty, so James remained free. Police later suspected him of at least 5 more similar episodes in which an unknown man in a car abducted girls from the street. In 2010, a girl who went to the same church as James complained about him. She admitted that the man, who was 63 years old at the time, had been molesting her for months. In all, the victim reported several similar episodes, and Neal confessed. The only thing that happened next was something incomprehensible. The case was somehow hushed up. The victim recanted her accusations, and the men went unpunished. James returned to his usual life, and for the next 9 years, he was not in the sight of police until he was arrested for Linda's murder. When questioned, the man denied any involvement and said he had never kidnapped the girls. When shown a photo of Linda, he said he had never seen her, with the man adding that she looked like one of his daughters. Given that the suspect's DNA was clearly on the victim's body, the court should have found him guilty anyway. Nevertheless, investigators tried to get as much evidence as they could. They wanted to find out if James had a turquoise van, but could not find a single confirmation of that fact. However, this was quickly explained. At the time of Linda's murder, he was a worker in an apartment complex and had access to the service van. During the search of his home, investigators found several hard drives containing illegal materials. Similar photos and videos were also found on his smartphone. Something interesting was also found on his computer. It turned out that James had studied the history of violent criminals who had been caught through DNA analysis. Apparently, he was well aware that it was DNA that could help the police link him to various atrocities. Another surprising discovery awaited the detectives after James was examined before moving into his cell. He had a tattoo of Linda's name on his wrist. Investigators thought he had left a reminder of his victim that way. However, it turned out to be an eerie coincidence. James had gotten the tattoo long before the murder, and the police were able to confirm it. The trial was supposed to start a year after the arrest in February 2020, but it was postponed because of the pandemic. James continued to insist his innocence, but detectives no longer doubted that he had killed Linda. However, the case never came to trial. In May, James was admitted to the hospital, where he died 2 days later of lung cancer. He did not know about his illness before his arrest, and when it was discovered, it was too late to begin treatment. Thus, the half-century-old case was finally put to rest. Detectives still believe that James may have had many more victims, and they intend to keep investigating in that direction. Linda's parents passed away long before the police found the perpetrator. Her mother blamed herself for what happened throughout her life, as she refused to pick up the girl from school. Linda's sisters thanked the investigators for not giving up on the case and getting to the bottom of it. Their only regret was that their parents had not lived to see the day. Angelica Hadsell was born on August 9, 1996, in the suburb of Norfolk, Virginia. Soon she had 2 younger sisters, but in 2005 her parents divorced and the young women stayed with their mother. In 2010 her mother remarried and they had another daughter. Thus, Angelica had 3 younger sisters with whom she got along well. Angelica graduated from a local high school and enrolled at Longwood University in Farmville, located about 3 hours from home. She joined 2 sports teams and planned to finish her studies a year early, which required her to work at an accelerated pace. Despite this, she regularly visited her family in Norfolk to see her parents and sisters. In March 2015, when Angelica was 18, she went home for spring break, planning to stay there for a few days. Angelica had a great time with her family, was in a great mood, and was happy to have the opportunity to live at home again. On the morning of March 2nd, her mother prepared her 3 younger daughters for school and then went to work, leaving Angelica alone at home. However, when her mother returned from work in the afternoon, Angelica was no longer there. Everything looked like she had left in a hurry. The back door was open, music was playing, and only some of her things were loaded into the washing machine. Her mother found this strange because she and her daughter constantly kept in touch, and Angelica was supposed to inform her if she was going somewhere. But that day, Angelica didn't answer her phone. Then her mother wrote to her and asked where she had gone. Angelica replied that she had gone for a walk with friends, but didn't specify where exactly and when she planned to return home. They exchanged several messages, and her mother noticed something strange again. According to her, the messages from her daughter were very different in style from what she was used to. Usually, Angelica wrote her detailed messages, telling her all the details, but this time she only received short and vague phrases. Despite this, her mother did not suspect anything bad, especially since her daughter was already 18 years old, and she thought that the young woman just wanted to spend time with her friends. On that day, Angelica never came home, but continued to respond to messages. However, she still did not give clear answers about where she was and when she planned to return home. In the second half of the day, the young woman stopped responding to her mother. Then she decided to call Angelica's friends and found out that none of them had seen her daughter and did not know where she was. By the evening of March 3rd, the mother decided to turn to the police. Detectives began an investigation, and at first glance, it seemed like the young woman had left on her own free will. Soon, this version was supported by a note found in the house. Angelica's mother claimed that it was probably written in her daughter's handwriting. There was only one sentence with a very strange content. Angelica wrote that due to everything that was happening, she needed time alone with herself. No one in her family could understand what she meant. The young woman was cheerful, spent all of her free time studying and making plans for the future. She never mentioned any serious problems in her life, so the note seemed meaningless. The police also found that Angelica left her clothes, wallet, and car at home. This already contradicted the version that she had gone somewhere of her own free will. However, at that time, there was no evidence to the contrary. The first lead appeared several days after the investigation. A neighbor named Cody, who lived near Angelica's family, found a piece of her credit card near his house. He reported this to the police and immediately became the main suspect. Detectives assumed that he could have some connection to her disappearance, so they questioned him for 12 hours. He denied his guilt, and yet the police did not rush to remove suspicion from him. Angelica's relatives also believed that he was hiding something. By that time, all residents of the area knew about this case, and many tried to help the investigation. People formed teams and searched the area for any evidence. They all began to suspect Cody after the credit card incident. Moreover, it turned out that he and Angelica attended the same school and dated for some time. Soon, another event occurred that indicated his involvement in her disappearance. Less than a week after the investigation began, Angelica's stepfather, Wesley Hadsell, burst into Cody's house and found Angelica's jacket there. The situation developed quite strangely. Wesley, who was involved in the search for his daughter with her friends, told them to go to Cody's house and look for Angelica's things, as he believed that the boy was involved in her disappearance. The friends did just that. They went to Cody's house and found her jacket there, which they immediately reported to the police. Cody was interrogated again, putting serious pressure on him. Despite this, Cody said that he had no idea where the jacket came from. All of this greatly confused the investigators. On the one hand, the jacket in Cody's house was a very serious piece of evidence. But on the other hand, during the interrogation, the detectives had a strong impression that the boy was telling them the truth. He was willing to voluntarily provide his DNA sample, undergo a polygraph test, and do whatever they asked. But most importantly, he provided an alibi for the day of Angelica's disappearance. The police checked this information and concluded that he could really be innocent. Then they talked to Angelica's friends who found the jacket, and they told them that Wesley, Angelica's stepfather, gave them the tip. With this information, the detectives allowed that the man could have planted the jacket. And here was the main question. Why would he do that? The most obvious option was that Wesley was involved in his daughter's disappearance. The police began to study his biography and found that the man had more than 10 convictions for crimes of varying degrees of severity, and even more charges were not proven in court. He was repeatedly arrested for robbery, possession, and use of illegal substances, and in 2005, he kidnapped his own wife and subjected her to violence for several days. However, the court could not prove his guilt, so he did not receive any serious punishment. He had been in prison several times in his life, spending several years there in total. The detectives also found out that a few weeks before Angelica's disappearance, her mother kicked Wesley out of the house because he started using heavy illegal substances. Since then, he had been living in a hotel. All of this was enough to seriously consider him a suspect. During the interrogation, the man claimed that he had nothing to do with the disappearance of his daughter and was actively trying to find her. When asked when he last saw Angelica, Wesley stated that he saw her at a gas station around noon on the day of her disappearance. The young woman had asked him for a few $100s before they parted ways. However, the detectives reviewed the footage from the gas station cameras and found no evidence to support his claim. Wesley's colleagues at work reported that he had taken a few hours off on that day as his daughter had asked him for money. He returned to work at around 2 p.m. and was extremely nervous. There was an obvious contradiction in his statement. Wesley had told his colleagues that he needed to leave because his daughter had asked for money, but he told the police that he had accidentally spotted Angelica at the gas station while driving by. Furthermore, Angelica's car was parked near her home, so it was unclear why she would be at the gas station. When asked why he left work that day, Wesley stated that the alarm at the house where he lived before the quarrel with his wife had gone off, and he received a notification on his phone. The police could not verify this information, and it did not explain the obvious contradictions in his statement. The police then obtained a warrant to search Wesley's motel room, where he had been staying for the past few weeks. They found something interesting. Wesley had been keeping firearms and a large number of bullets. Since Wesley had several convictions, the law prohibited him from owning weapons, so he was immediately arrested. However, there was no evidence related to Angelica in his room. Thus, Wesley was charged with 3 crimes: illegal possession of a weapon, breaking into Cody's house, and tampering with evidence due to the jacket he had supposedly planted. He still insisted that he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance and was doing everything he could to find her. As a result, the court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, and the detectives continued to search for the young woman. They confiscated Wesley's work vehicle and found a shovel, tape, and dark gloves inside. However, the most interesting item was the GPS navigator, which they sent to experts for analysis. The investigators wanted to know where Wesley had gone in the days after Angelica's disappearance. According to the data they received, on March 4th, Wesley had driven to a neighboring town 90 kilometers away from Norfolk. His car had stayed in one place for 20 minutes before he drove back to work. Having arrived at the location on April 9th, the detective saw that his car was parked near an abandoned house in a remote area. After searching the area, they eventually found Angelica's body in a ditch not far from the building. She was covered with a piece of plywood, but even without it, it would have been extremely difficult to find her by chance, as the area around the house was overgrown and inaccessible, so no one could have stumbled upon her. The body was sent for a medical examination, and an unexpected statement awaited all participants in the process. According to the results, a dose of prohibited substances was found in the young woman's blood, which was 3 times the lethal dose for an average person. Angelica's family was in shock. The young woman didn't even drink alcohol, was actively involved in sports, and devoted almost all her time to studying. No one could believe that she was taking prohibited substances. Medical experts decided to conduct additional tests by analyzing the hair. It is possible to determine whether a person has taken narcotic drugs in the past, and this analysis showed that Angelica had never dealt with prohibited substances before. This made the version that she suddenly took a triple dose of her own free will practically impossible. In addition, someone buried her body in the ditch and covered it with a piece of plywood. Everything indicated that the young woman could have been given these substances against her will, with the sole purpose of killing her and making it look like an accident. The detectives questioned Wesley again, who was already in prison at the time. The first question they asked him was what his work car was doing near the house where Angelica's body was found. The man's version was, to put it mildly, unconvincing. He said that he could have been set up and that he didn't go there himself. At the same time, he had previously said that no one except him had access to this car. Wesley even suggested that someone could have taken the navigator from his car, driven to that house, and returned the gadget back. Meanwhile, the police collected footage from various street cameras located along the way to this house, and they did indeed manage to find several recordings that showed that on that same day, Wesley was in the city where his daughter's body was found, driving his work car. Despite all this pointing to the man's involvement in the murder, the court needed more evidence. Therefore, the police continued to work on this case for several more years, trying to find irrefutable evidence. As a result, Wesley was charged with the murder of Angelica only at the end of 2018. The main court hearings began in January 2022. According to the prosecution's version of events, on March 2nd, Wesley arrived at the house where Angelica was located with the sole purpose of kidnapping her for the purpose of committing violent acts. He took her out of the house, carried out his plan, and gave her a triple dose of prohibited substances because he initially planned to make it look like an accident. During countless interrogations, the police repeatedly found that the man carefully thought out his versions and tried in every way to divert suspicion from himself. The prosecution managed to find a witness who supported their version, a person who sold Wesley the same prohibited drugs that Angelica died from. The court also heard that the police found Angelica's phone on the street, and its location data was compared with Leslie's phone data. Since the young woman's disappearance, her smartphone was next to Wesley's smartphone, even when messages were sent from her mother's account. This indicated that it was Wesley who took Angelica's phone and tried to convince her mother that everything was okay with the young woman. The defendant's lawyers insisted that their client was innocent. According to their version, the young woman was depressed and decided to end her own life, and Wesley had nothing to do with it. This version did not explain why his car was near the place where her body was found, or who buried her, covering her with a piece of plywood. All these arguments tried to explain either coincidences or attempts to frame Wesley. Interestingly, the man had said many times before that he did not believe in the overdose version and believed that Angelica was murdered. But for some reason, his opinion changed in court. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. Wesley was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The man said he would appeal the verdict, and theoretically, he has a high enough chance of getting it overturned. As you may have already guessed, there is not a single material evidence against him. For example, no samples of his DNA were found on the victim's body, which would have been practically unquestionable evidence of guilt. The prosecution's main argument is the fact that Wesley's work car was actually located near the place where the young woman's body was later found. All other arguments are not serious evidence, although just this person's past alone makes any of his words questionable. Considering that 10 years before the incident, he also kidnapped his wife and subjected her to violence, the prosecution's version seems more than convincing. But due to the lack of more significant evidence, lawyers may well challenge this verdict and achieve a new hearing. Karen Slover was born on October 27, 1972, in the American city of Decatur, Illinois. After high school, she attended Richland Community College, where she met her future husband, Michael Slover. After college, they married in 1992, and less than a year later, their son Colton was born. The couple had to work hard to support their child and cover their own expenses. For this reason, Karen had to go back to work for a few days after giving birth. Michael's parents agreed to take care of the child, and he spent most of his working days with them. In the following years, Karen changed several jobs until she settled on the local newspaper. She worked in the advertising department, quickly found common ground with the team, and generally loved her job. A few years after their son's birth, the relationship between the couple began to deteriorate. Karen complained to friends that Michael often lost his temper and hit her during arguments. For this reason, she decided to file for divorce, and the court awarded her custody of Colton. However, she could not afford to hire a nanny for her child since her salary at the newspaper would not cover it. Michael's parents agreed to continue taking care of him while she was at work. After the divorce, she began dating a man named David Swan. They lived separately but saw each other regularly. Swan got along well with her son, and there were no serious problems in their relationship with Karen. In 1996, when her son was already 3 years old, Karen began to think about moving to another city and trying herself as a model. She started looking for suitable vacancies and soon received an invitation from a major modeling company in the state of Georgia. She had been eagerly awaiting the move, but continued to work at the editorial office until the last minute in order to save up money for herself and her son for the first time. On September 27th, Karen left work around 5 p.m., telling her colleagues that she was going to pick up Colton from his grandparents and go to the shopping center with him. The woman planned to attend the wedding of her acquaintance and wanted to buy a suitable dress, but that evening, Karen never picked up her son. Several hours passed and the woman was still missing. She also did not contact her former husband's parents or anyone else. Around 10 p.m. that evening, a patrol officer noticed a suspicious car on the shoulder of Highway 72 near the town of Champaign. The driver's door was open, the headlights were on, and the engine was running. At first, the officer thought that the car had some problems and the driver was trying to fix them. However, as he approached closer, he discovered that there was no one inside the car or nearby. Inside the car, the police found a woman's purse with Karen's documents, a half-eaten chocolate bar, and a package of food from a cafe. Everything looked as if the woman had just left the car and was about to return soon, but she was nowhere to be found. The officer ran the car's license plates and found that it was registered to David Swan. Contacting him, he learned that the man had lent his car to Karen while her car was being repaired. He explained that the woman was supposed to pick up her son from her grandparents that evening, and investigators headed to their home. Meanwhile, the car was taken to the police station, where the forensic experts studied it more closely. Karen's former husband's parents said that the woman was supposed to come right after work, but she never showed up all day. Colton was still there, and his mother could not just leave him without warning. The police began to suspect that the woman may have been abducted or that the car theft did not go as planned. Detectives immediately noticed that the location where the car was found did not match the timeline of events that evening. Karen left the office and headed to her former husband's parents' house before going to the store in Forsyth. Her car was found almost 60 kilometers away. This suggested that the car may have been left there by a criminal who wanted to confuse investigators. The woman herself could not have ended up near another city, as she needed to pick up her son and prepare for a wedding that was supposed to take place the next day. While experts tried to find any clues in the car, such as fingerprints, detectives decided to question employees of stores, hairdressers, and beauty salons in Forsyth. The next day, they went there showing them photos of Karen, but no one had seen her. Forensic experts could not find fingerprints in the car, but something seemed strange to them. On the passenger seat, they found traces of cement and ash. David Swan stated that they were not there when he gave the car to his girlfriend. In addition, several stalks of tall grass were found in the salon, which also raised questions. The car was on the side of the road, along which there was no such vegetation. Moreover, several scattered coins were found in the car, but it did not give them any serious leads. Upon learning of Karen's disappearance, her relatives, colleagues, and friends participated in large-scale searches. Some groups combed the area around the road where her car was found, while others distributed leaflets throughout the city. The management of the newspaper where the women worked offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find her, but all of this did not yield any results. On October 1st, a distressing call came to the police. Fishermen noticed a garbage bag on the shore of Lake Shelbyville, located 50 kilometers from Decatur. It seemed strange to them that someone had left garbage in such a deserted place, so they decided to take it with them to throw away. Later, however, men quickly realized that it was far from garbage. The bag was tightly wrapped in tape and weighed quite a lot, so the fishermen decided to check its contents. To their horror, they saw a woman's head inside. Investigators immediately thought that the victim could be Karen, so they requested her dental records to establish her identity. Their fears were confirmed. The head did indeed belong to her. Meanwhile, police officers and divers searched the lake and soon found several more bags with other parts of Karen's body. Medical experts concluded that the woman died from 7 gunshot wounds, after which an unknown perpetrator dismembered her body using something like a gasoline saw and distributed it in bags. In each of them, there was an additional piece of concrete block to add weight. Detectives assumed that the killer threw the packages from a bridge over the lake. They even managed to find fingerprints on the railings, but these samples were not enough for comparison. In the following days, several more packages surfaced and washed up on the shore, but the police still failed to find all parts of the victim's body. Considering the brutality with which Karen was killed, investigators made a logical conclusion that the perpetrator was likely someone who hated the victim and therefore knew her well. This explained why the criminal fired a total of 7 shots. Based on this, they began looking for possible suspects among her close acquaintances. Friends of the woman told detectives that her ex-husband sometimes beat Karen and often threatened her during their arguments. This immediately aroused suspicions among the investigators, and they decided to question him. Michael said he had been at work all day, as he worked in 3 different places as a security guard at a grocery store, a karate instructor, and a bouncer at a bar. The man finished his shift at the store around 3 p.m., then went straight to the gym where he worked out. After that, he went home, took a shower, and immediately left for work at the bar. Investigators carefully checked his story, but the man really had a solid alibi for the whole day. Many people at all 3 of his workplaces saw him, and detectives specifically highlighted the time frame when Karen left work and when they found her car. Michael had a serious alibi for the whole day, so he was no longer considered a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to Karen's boyfriend, and here, everything turned out to be much more interesting. It turned out that David Swan had previously been arrested for assault and had also posed as a police officer. Moreover, the guy had some mental problems which led him to be sent to a psychiatric hospital. After his girlfriend disappeared, he actively participated in the search efforts and did not miss any opportunity to talk to reporters and give interviews. The police considered such behavior slightly suspicious, as David tried to attract as much attention to himself as possible. They suspected that this was the way the man was trying to deflect suspicion, which often happens if the killer is someone close to the victim. This person may be more active than anyone else in the media, calling on the police to find the culprit and generally staying at the center of the investigation. In addition, David misled his friends about his relationship with Karen. He told them that they were going to get married soon, but her friends said the couple had only been dating for a month, and Karen wasn't even thinking about marriage at this stage. Investigators also found out that David owned a chainsaw, which he sometimes used to butcher deer after hunting. Given that Karen's body was dismembered in a similar way, this only strengthened suspicions against him. In addition, the man owned a gun of the same caliber that was used to kill the victim, but the main snag was with his alibi. On the evening of the woman's disappearance, David was supposed to attend his acquaintance's wedding as a chauffeur, but he was very late for the event. As a result, the man had no alibi for about 45 minutes, which coincided with the time of Karen's murder. Taking into account all the above, the detectives were almost certain that he was the killer. The man was questioned for about 4 hours, trying to get a confession out of him. When he began to list literally every action he took that evening, the police heard something interesting. David said he withdrew money from an ATM, and the investigators immediately requested footage from the camera of the machine. To their surprise, this story was confirmed. David did withdraw money at the time that filled the gap in his alibi. The man physically could not have killed Karen and driven the car to another city, so all suspicions were lifted from him. At this point, the detectives had essentially run out of leads. They took one more step that could help them find the killer over time. Tall grass, like the kind found in Karen's car, was often found on abandoned or outlying plots of land. In the city itself, it was constantly mowed down as required by law. The police walked around the outskirts of the city and talked to local residents, asking them to report any strange things they might have seen in this area. The detectives continued to question Karen's relatives and acquaintances in an effort to find new suspects. They found out that the woman had not gotten along with her former mother-in-law, and the relationship had been quite tense at times. Jeanette Slover was very attached to her grandson and did not want to give him up, even to his own mother. Karen sometimes had to forcefully take Colton from their home, and it seemed that Jeanette considered the boy to be her own child rather than her grandchild. But the strangest discovery was yet to come. The police found out that Jeanette had occasionally breastfed Colton. The investigators decided to take a closer look at Slover and spoke with them again. Jeanette claimed that she had been at home with her grandson all day and had tried to call Karen on their home phone when she didn't show up at the appointed time. But the woman didn't answer. The police requested data on calls from their home and found that Slover had never called Karen that day, but instead, their phone had made multiple outgoing calls to their son Michael's number. Karen's former father-in-law told the police that he had left home for less than an hour that evening to buy toys for Colton at a local store. The investigators decided to check this information and found out that the store had never sold toys from that manufacturer. What was even more suspicious was that the man was absent around the same time that Karen was killed. The detectives began to seriously consider Slover's involvement and even identified a possible motive. The victim was planning to move to another state to work as a model, and her son would have gone with her. Considering how attached Jeanette was to Colton, she theoretically could have gone to murder to keep him from being taken away from her. The investigators also found out that Slover had an automotive business. They owned a large plot of land converted into a parking lot for used cars, but it had been practically unused for several years. When the police obtained a search warrant and arrived there, they discovered that the area was littered with broken concrete blocks, just like the ones that had been found in bags with parts of Karen's body. However, the investigators could not confirm that these were the same blocks. In addition, they could not find any evidence, and Slover themselves refused to continue the dialogue with the police and hired a lawyer. At that moment, the investigation had stalled because there were no other leads for the detectives. It was only resumed 2 years later, in 1998, when a new team of detectives decided to re-examine the area where Slover's business was located. They believed that Karen may have been killed there and that some evidence must have been left behind. As for the Slover family themselves, they had all moved to another state during that time. Michael's sister, Mary, had set up Colton and he was living with them. Before the move, they had hired workers to carry out repairs on the business premises. This raised even more suspicions, but without any solid evidence, the detectives were powerless. For the second search in 1998, the investigators enlisted the help of a forensic expert and also sought assistance from the local military base's leadership. They needed as many people as possible to comb through every inch of the area. Over the next 6 months, they collected and sifted through the top layer of soil, searched for traces of blood on every stone until they finally bore fruit. They found a button and rivets from the jeans that Karen was wearing on the day of the murder. Later, they found another button, this time from her blouse. This confirmed the police's theory that the woman's body could have been dismembered and placed in packages on the business premises. The detectives believed that Jeanette, along with her husband, was involved in this, while their daughter Mary was left to babysit Colton. According to their version of events, Jeanette personally shot Karen when she came to pick up her son, after which she and her husband took her body to their business premises. However, the buttons alone were not enough to hold her accountable. The police interviewed all the people who lived near the site and learned that Karen's ex-husband was mowing the grass on the evening after the murder. This only reinforced the investigators' version, according to which Michael not only knew about the crime, but also helped his parents cover up their tracks. Moreover, this confirmed that the site was covered with tall grass, just like Karen's car. Apparently, Jeanette and her husband drove the car away from the city to confuse the investigators and the grass could have ended up in the car with them. Another witness reported that the Slovers were burning something on the premises on the day of the murder. According to detectives, this is how they got rid of the evidence. But that wasn't all. The most shocking piece of evidence that truly shocked the detectives was found in the packages where they discovered parts of Karen's body. A small black hair was found on the tape used to wrap one of the packages. It turned out to belong to a dog, and Slover happened to have a black Labrador. The detectives obtained a warrant and took hair samples from the Slover's dog brush. DNA analysis showed a complete match, which only strengthened the case against the entire family. Once the police took the brush for analysis, Jeanette and her husband did something that further convinced everyone of their involvement. They immediately put their dog to sleep, apparently fearing they could be accused of the murder through the dog, but they didn't know it was already too late. Gathering all of this evidence together, the police arrested Jeanette, her husband, and son on January 27, 2000. All three were charged with murder, but the family continued to deny any involvement. The case was then brought to trial, which didn't conclude until 2002. Despite all of the evidence and witness testimonies, the jury found them guilty. Michael and his father received 65 years in prison each, while Jeanette received 60 years. In 2003, they attempted to appeal the verdict, but their request was denied by the court. It seemed like the end of the story, but not for Karen's son, who still had to go through some trials of his own. As I mentioned earlier, he was adopted by Michael's sister, Mary. The court made this decision despite Karen's parents also fighting for custody rights. When Mary's relatives were accused of murder, a logical question arose. Did the woman know that her family members had committed the crime? If she knowingly stayed behind to look after Colton while her mother and father got rid of the body, it would make her an accomplice, but it was practically impossible to prove. Karen's parents still went to court, demanding that Mary be stripped of her parental rights and that they be given custody of that boy. A year later, in 2003, the judge ruled in their favor, and Colton remained living with his maternal grandparents. During this process, it was revealed that Mary hated Karen and even told acquaintances several times that she wished her dead. Additionally, the court found that she had tried to make the boy forget about his biological mother in every way possible. At the moment, the whole trio is still serving their punishment. Jeanette will be eligible for early release in 2029 when she will be over 80 years old, while her husband and son will be able to be released after 2030. To this day, they insist on their innocence and try to challenge the verdict, but all these attempts lead to nothing. Carrie Nelson was born on December 13, 1980, in the small American town of Laverne, Minnesota. She had loving parents, a younger sister, and many friends. Carrie was kind, empathetic, and always tried to help her loved ones. After graduating from the local high school, she enrolled in college in the neighboring state of North Dakota. She wanted to become a doctor so that she could help others. While in college, she met a young man named Mike Kellen, and they became engaged after a while. Carrie tried to balance her college studies with part-time work at the National Blue Mountain State Park, located near her hometown. Her duties included selling park tickets and escorting guests who came to relax at the camping site, go hiking, or see the bison. Carrie worked there for the second season in a row, and she loved the place. In addition to being a relatively easy job, she could also spend a lot of time in nature, enjoying the picturesque landscapes. On May 20, 2001, she went to work as usual. That day, besides her, only one young woman named Rebecca, who was doing an internship at the park, was working there. In addition to her main duties, Carrie had to train and introduce her to the work process. Carrie's shift started at 8 a.m. and was supposed to end at 3:30 p.m. For most of the day, she was with Rebecca, explaining the work nuances. Around 12:45, Rebecca went to the office building located at the other end of the park, and Carrie stayed in a small room at the entrance. Rebecca returned around 2:30 p.m. She entered the building through the back door and immediately saw a horrific scene. Carrie lay motionless on the floor with a pool of blood near her head. At around the same time, a shocked Rebecca heard the front door. Thinking it might be the same person who attacked her colleague, she immediately ran out through the back door and rushed home. The young woman lived in a house located within the park grounds because her father was the manager, so she quickly ran there. Rebecca told her parents what had happened, and her father immediately ran there, while the young woman's mother called the police. The man arrived at the building and found no one there except Carrie. He tried to feel her pulse and realized that she was dead. After that, he closed the curtains, locked the front door, and called 911. At around the same time, another call came in to the police. It turned out that when Rebecca discovered her colleague's body inside, a park visitor walked in, not the attacker. The woman went to the registration desk and saw Carrie's body next to a puddle of blood, then returned to her car and also called 911. Police arrived on the scene and began their investigation. The young woman's body was lying behind the registration desk where phones and cash registers were located, and things and papers were scattered around. One of the phone receivers was off the hook, the plastic pen of Carrie's chair was broken, and its pieces were on the floor. Based on this, the police assumed that a struggle had taken place between the victim and the attacker. After talking to the managers, the investigators found out that 2 bank bags intended for money storage had disappeared from the building. In addition, cash was taken from the cash register, with the total amount stolen being approximately $2,000. On the floor, detectives found several clues: men's wristwatches with a torn strap and a pack of cigarettes. Considering that Carrie did not smoke, the police assumed that the cigarettes were left by her killer. As for the watches, they assumed that the young woman tore them off the perpetrator's wrist during the struggle. Large particles of orange-colored stone were also found on the floor. The manager told investigators that these particles likely came from the decorative stone with the park's name, which was located on the registration desk. The police searched all the rooms and could not find the perpetrator. Considering that blood spatters were visible on the walls and ceiling of the room, they immediately assumed that this stone was the murder weapon. At the same time, their colleagues blocked the road leading to the park entrance and began questioning all visitors. The couple who stopped at the campground reported that around 2:30 p.m., a white car with a brown vinyl top drove past them at high speed. Unfortunately, they did not remember the model or license plate number of the vehicle. The investigation was complicated by the fact that there were no surveillance cameras in the park since crimes were very rare. The available evidence included a wristwatch, a pack of cigarettes, and the vague testimony of witnesses. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that the cause of death was blows to the head with a heavy object. They suggested that the perpetrator may have used a large decorative stone, but this version could only be confirmed after its discovery. According to the investigators, the attack on Carrie occurred between 2 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. They found a love letter that she had written to her fiancé at her workplace. In the letter, Carrie expressed her eagerness for their wedding and described her desire to have 2 children. She put the date and time of 2 p.m. that day on the letter. Another interesting fact was that the men's watch found next to the victim's body stopped at 2:16 p.m. Perhaps they stopped working just after Carrie had taken them off her attacker's wrist. Police cordoned off the park and began searching for additional clues. 5 days later, they found the decorative stone in a nearby stream. Apparently, the killer took it with him and threw it into the stream from a bridge while driving over it. Medical experts compared the relief of the stone with Carey's head injuries and confirmed that it was the murder weapon. However, the water had washed away all fingerprints and DNA traces that the perpetrator may have left. No other clues were found, and the police began searching for a possible suspect. They first looked closely at Carey's fiancé, but he had a reliable alibi. At the time of the murder, he was attending a funeral about 110 kilometers away from the park. Around 3 p.m. that day, he tried to call Carey at her work phone. At that time, he had no idea that his fiancée was dead. Detectives interviewed park employees and received an interesting lead. Several people told them that Carey had complained to them multiple times about her 26-year-old colleague named Stephen. Carey reported that he continuously asked her out on a date, despite her being engaged. Stephen ignored her refusals and behaved quite persistently, causing Carey to fear him. Additionally, the man used heavy narcotics and sold them to park visitors. Carey mentioned to her colleagues that she was considering reporting him to the police or management. The detectives immediately questioned him, and he did not have a reliable alibi for the time of the murder. He did not work that day and claimed he was at his daughter's birthday party a few kilometers away from the park. However, he arrived at the party around 3 p.m., which means he could have had enough time to commit the crime. In addition, he drove a white Cadillac, while witnesses saw a light-colored vehicle leaving the park at high speed. Digging deeper, the detectives found out that Stephen had financial difficulties. This gave him a motive to commit robbery, especially since he knew where the money was kept. The detectives also suspected that he may have learned about Carey's plans to report him and decided to murder her. They seized his car and took a DNA sample from him. Meanwhile, the forensic team finished collecting fingerprints and DNA samples from the crime scene, including DNA from a men's wristwatch. In total, 135 different fingerprints were found at the scene, excluding all park employees, including Stephen, leaving 38 unknown prints. As for the wristwatch, 3 different DNA samples were found on it. The problem was that these samples were not enough to create a full profile, since DNA analysis technology was not yet advanced enough in 2001. As a result, experts had to work with partial profiles. They tried to add them to databases, but the results were inconclusive. The system showed them 19 possible matches, and during the investigation, the police confirmed that none of these people were related to the murder. However, the experts were able to directly compare the obtained samples with other DNA. They determined that one of the samples belonged to Carey, and the other 2 did not match any of the park employees, including Stephen. Detectives did not rush to rule him out, as he had a motive and opportunity to commit the crime, but there was no evidence against him. No other leads were found, and the case remained unsolved for months. A year after the murder, a prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward to the police. He told them that his cellmate, Anthony Powers, had boasted to him about being responsible for Carey's murder. Detectives investigated and found that Powers had an extensive criminal history, mostly for bank robberies, which had landed him in jail multiple times. Interestingly, Powers had escaped from prison shortly before Carey's murder and was caught after the fact. His fingerprints and DNA did not match those found at the crime scene. Moreover, the witness's description of the murder did not match reality. The detectives concluded that both prisoners were attempting to deceive them for a reward of $50,000 for information leading to solving of the case. Since Powers was already serving a life sentence, additional charges did not scare him. Additionally, in the event of a guilty verdict, he could have avoided being transferred to a federal prison and remained in the state correctional facility, which he preferred. The case remained unsolved for several years. Detectives regularly reviewed the case, hoping to find new evidence, but their efforts were fruitless. They even put up a photo of Carrie in their office to remind themselves of the case every day. In 2007, the case was reopened. By that time, DNA analysis technology had significantly advanced and experts re-examined the wristwatch. This time, they were able to identify 3 precise DNA profiles, one belonging to Carrie, the second to an unknown man, and the third to an unknown woman. Both of these samples were run through the state database, but no matches were found. Then the detectives remembered an interesting detail. A special sticker was found on the pack of cigarettes discovered next to the victim's body. In those days, each state had to label tobacco products, so the police knew for sure that the pack was purchased in South Dakota. The detectives then sent the DNA samples to their colleagues in that state, and here they had a long-awaited breakthrough. When they ran these profiles through the South Dakota database, one of them showed a complete match. The man turned out to be 35-year-old Randy LeRoyal Swaney. This name had never appeared in police reports in Carrie's case, so it was a surprise for the investigators. Randy turned out to be a serial robber, and at that time, he was serving a 30-month sentence in a South Dakota prison. At the time of the murder, he was out on parole. The police also discovered that he had a light-colored Oldsmobile Delta at that time, which matched the witness's description. The investigators checked his fingerprints, and they matched several prints found at the murder scene. Despite all this, the detectives wanted to gather as much evidence as possible before charging him. Randy had only 1 month left to serve in prison, so the police decided to act as quickly as possible. They spoke to his wife, not mentioning what her husband was suspected of. The woman was already used to Randy regularly coming to the attention of the police for robberies and thefts, so she was not surprised by their visit. The detectives showed her photos of a watch, and the woman immediately confirmed that they belonged to her husband. She also said that she sometimes wore them, and the investigators immediately realized that the last DNA sample from the watch belonged to her. Then they decided to reveal everything and told her that they suspected her husband of killing a young woman. The woman burst into tears, but the police quickly realized that she was primarily scared for herself. Learning that her DNA might be on the watch, she thought that she too would be accused of the murder. On April 19th, detectives came to visit Randy in prison and attempted to speak with him without specifying what he was being suspected of. However, Randy refused to talk without a lawyer present. After the unsuccessful interrogation, Randy called his wife. As all prison calls are recorded, the police were able to listen in. The woman was angry and asked, "What did he do?" She revealed that detectives were investigating him for a murder that occurred in Blue Mound State Park and was more worried about her DNA being found on a watch. At times, she began to cry and scream that she didn't want to go to jail for a crime she had nothing to do with. Randy, on the other hand, repeated that he knew nothing about it. The woman actively cooperated with the police, providing her DNA samples and allowing them to search their home. She also gave them several photos of Randy, one of which showed him sitting behind the wheel of a white car similar to the one witnesses saw. In another photo, the man's watch was visible and was fastened to the fourth clasp, just like the watch found at the crime scene. Additionally, his wife confirmed that Randy smoked the same brand of cigarettes that were found near the body. All of this was enough to take the case to trial. Randy was charged on May 8, 2007, one day before his release. He was immediately transferred to a prison in Minnesota, and the prosecution began preparing for the trial. According to their version of events, Randy initially chose the park building as an easy target for robbery. There were no cameras or guards, but there was cash. When he entered, Carrie may have been in another room. Seeing that nobody was there, Randy began stealing money from the cash register, but the young woman returned and caught him in the act. A struggle ensued, and the man may have used threats to make her open the safe. Afterward, he took a decorative stone and struck her more than 5 times because he feared leaving a witness alive. Even his relatives, including his wife, testified against him in court. They all said that Randy regularly committed thefts, used banned substances, and had serious gambling problems, which constantly put him in debt. His former cellmate told how Randy mentioned leaving his watch at the crime scene. Another cellmate claimed that after the police came to interrogate Randy in jail, he said, "This time they got me. I'm looking at life." Randy's lawyers insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. According to their version, Randy lost his watch sometime before the incident, and the real killer found it. However, this version conflicted with the results of DNA analysis. There were 3 samples of genetic material on the watch: Randy's, his wife's, and Carrie's. Randy claimed that on that day, he went fishing near a town about 150 kilometers away from the park. However, since he supposedly was there alone, no one could confirm his alibi. He also said that he had been in the park only once, long before the murder. He admitted that he left his fingerprints there at that time, but there was another discrepancy. One of Randy's fingerprints was found on a leaflet that was made only 4 days before the murder. All defense arguments had no weight and contradicted real evidence, and Randy's lawyers tried to blame someone else. First, he called Powers and another inmate to testify, but their stories still did not match reality. Then he began to harass the victim's fiancée, constantly hinting that he could be the real killer. The trial lasted until August 15, 2008. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Randy guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After that, he continued to insist on his innocence and filed multiple appeals, but they were all rejected. From the beginning, all his defense was built on absurd versions that contradicted DNA analysis and other evidence, so there are no chances for his case to ever be reconsidered. Sierra Joggin was born on February 11, 1996, in the small American town of Delta, Ohio. The girl grew up in a very large and friendly family. She had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Sierra loved to play sports and was on the school volleyball team. She also loved to travel. The girl dreamed of visiting Italy and put a lot of effort into making that wish come true until she finally managed to go there. During her studies, she started dating a guy named Josh. After graduating high school, they went to different universities. Sierra planned to get a job with her uncle, who owned a metal fabrication company, and the young woman decided to major in human resources. She enrolled at Toledo University, located 50 kilometers from her home. Despite the distance, she and Josh planned to keep dating and made plans for their future. The couple even began to take their time choosing engagement rings for their future wedding. After 2 years at university, the young woman went to her hometown for a summer vacation. At that point, she still had some schoolwork to close, but she decided to do it from home so she could spend more time with her family and her boyfriend. In addition to that, Sierra was also doing an internship with her uncle's company. She was in her 20s at the time, and the young woman was thoroughly preparing to work there after graduation. On July 19, 2016, Sierra decided to drive to her boyfriend's house. She had bought a new bike a few days before, and she couldn't wait to try it out. The young woman left the house at about 5 p.m. and headed toward Josh's house. Around 9 p.m., her mother came home and found her daughter not there. This struck her as a little strange. She thought Sierra would have come home by now, but it was summer and it was just starting to get dark outside. Besides, the young woman was already in her 20s and her mother didn't worry about it. She had assumed that her daughter would stay at the boyfriend's house, but that all changed when Josh called her at 10:30 p.m. He asked if Sarah was home, since the boyfriend couldn't reach her. According to the young man, they broke up at about 7 p.m. and she hasn't been in touch since. Considering that more than 3 hours had passed since then, the young woman's mother began to get seriously worried. Together with Josh, they started calling friends and relatives of the young woman, hoping she had stopped by one of them. But no one had seen her that night. Then the mother called all the nearby hospitals, but there was no one there either. Eventually, the woman decided to go to the police, and around midnight, she filed a missing persons report. Despite the fact that Sierra was 20 years old, the police immediately began their search. Given that Josh was the last person to see her, they went to him. The guy said that the young woman arrived at his house shortly after 5 p.m. After about an hour and a half, they decided to go for a ride together. Sierra rode her bike and Josh rode his motorcycle. The couple rode along country roads, along numerous cornfields. Josh even took a picture of Sierra on her bike, and the young woman posted it on social media. After riding around for a while, they decided to go their separate ways. Sierra and Josh separated about a mile away from her house. The guy rode back on his motorcycle, and she headed home on her bike. While the police talked to the young man, other officers drove around looking for Sierra. They headed for the road near where the young woman had begun her journey home alone, and soon they were able to spot the first disturbing tip-off. As they drove along the road along the fields, one of the officers saw that the corn stalks in one place were heavily pinched, as if someone had waded through them. He walked over there with a flashlight and after a few yards saw Sierra's bicycle. On examining it, the policeman saw traces of blood on the handles and seat. Next to the bicycle was a woman's sock, which also had bloodstains on it. He reported the find to his colleagues, and soon other police officers arrived on the scene. On closer inspection, they found several other items not far from the bike. There were men's sunglasses, a screwdriver, and some car fuses. Just as interesting was the fact that motorcycle tire tracks led to the bicycle across the cornfield. All this was enough for the investigators to come to a disappointing conclusion. It was likely that Sarah had been stolen. As the case took a serious turn, they began to look closely at Josh as a possible suspect. First of all, statistically speaking, it is the people closest to them who are most likely to turn out to be the perpetrators. Secondly, that night Josh was riding a motorcycle, and next to the bike Sierra found similar tire tracks. Besides that, the detectives wondered why the guy didn't walk the young woman home. She had less than a mile to go, and he was on a motorcycle and could have gotten home quickly anyway. Josh allowed the police officers to look around his house, his car, and his motorcycle, and that's where the officers came across his work overalls, which showed signs of blood. The young man said he wore the clothes when he was hunting, and the blood belonged to animals. Investigators turned the overalls over to experts, and they quickly confirmed that he was telling the truth. Otherwise, there was nothing to suggest Josh was involved. The experts also examined the items found in the field and extracted one DNA sample from them that belonged to an unknown person. Josh immediately volunteered his sample, and they did not match. As a result, he was no longer considered a suspect. and the police started looking for other leads. The next day, they received a call from a farmer. The man told them that on the evening of Sierra's disappearance, he was driving down the same road with his son. At one point, they noticed a motorcycle helmet on the side of the road, and the father told his son to bring it to the car. The farmer later examined it more closely and saw traces of blood on it, and then contacted the police. Detectives admitted that the helmet may have belonged to the kidnapper, but his identity remained a mystery. At this point, the FBI was already involved in the case, and the agents decided to take a close look at the photo that Josh had taken of Sierra shortly before her disappearance. Thanks to the photo, they knew what kind of clothes she was wearing, but the detectives noticed something else. The young woman was wearing a fitness bracelet on her wrist. They immediately requested geolocation data for the device, but here the investigators were unsuccessful. The device had been turned off shortly after Sierra disappeared. The police received another tip shortly thereafter. Josh told them that as he and the young woman were driving down the road, a suspicious white van followed them. The guy got the feeling that the driver was following them. The vehicle was traveling at a slow speed and slowed down when the couple slowed down. At one point, Josh even tried to drive up to him, but the driver pulled away. The guy thought it was strange, and he even remembered part of his license plate number. The police quickly found the vehicle and its owner. She turned out to be a woman, and detectives determined that she had nothing to do with the crime. During the conversation, she herself accused Josh of trying to drive up to her and push her off the road. As a result, investigators decided that there had simply been a miscommunication between them and continued to look for more leads. Several days had passed since Sierra's disappearance, but the police were still unable to find any additional clues. Then, they decided to go through all the residents who had been previously convicted of violent crimes and lived in nearby communities. Going through the list of these people, they immediately noticed one man, 57-year-old James Worley. He lived only a few kilometers from the field where Sierra's bicycle was found. The reason the police were so interested in him was very simple. James had been convicted of kidnapping a young woman in the 1990s. She was riding her bicycle when suddenly a man ran over her in his van. Threatening her with a screwdriver, he tried to force the young woman into the car, but she managed to escape. Given that Sierra disappeared during the bike ride and the screwdriver found next to him, police quickly suspected James of kidnapping her. Investigators went to him to verify this theory. The man was clearly unhappy about the visit and stated that he had not killed anyone. Nevertheless, he voluntarily allowed the officers to inspect his home. James and his mother lived on a 120-acre farm, and there were many different structures on this huge property. It took the detectives a long time to look at them all. During this process, James kept repeating to the police that he had not kidnapped Sierra and had only heard about the case from the news. This behavior began to seem strange to them. The man was literally repeating the same thing over and over again, but something more interestingly awaited them next. Suddenly, James said that on the night of Sierra's disappearance, he had just driven along that road and his motorcycle had stalled near the very spot where the police later found the young woman's bicycle. According to James, he saw her bike and decided to get closer, so he headed into the field, pushing his motorcycle nearby. The man added that as he walked there, his car fuses, sunglasses, screwdriver, and helmet fell out. Suddenly, his motorcycle started up again and James drove on, forgetting to pick up all those items. As you might have guessed, the detectives were very suspicious of this story. In addition, just a few hours earlier, a witness had approached them and said that the evening of Sierra's disappearance, he had seen a strange van on that road. The witness noticed it because the vehicle was driving at a very high speed, breaking all possible rules. He memorized the license plate number and gave that information to the police. After running the plates, detectives learned that the van belonged to James, and during a search, they spotted it near the house. The man also allowed them to examine the van, and the officers found something of interest. Inside were a ski mask, duct tape, plastic clamps, handcuffs, and a mace. The items themselves did not in any way indicate his guilt, but given James' criminal record for kidnapping, such a set made investigators suspicious. But the creepiest finds awaited them in one of the barns. Detectives found a separate room where behind a hidden door, inside which was an air mattress. Beside it were chains that looked as if they had been designed to keep a person in the room. Next to the mattress was a refrigerator, inside of which the police found traces of blood. There was also a strong smell of bleach, from which they deduced that the blood had been thoroughly cleaned. But the main clue was the contents of a small box. There were bras and several pairs of women's underwear, one of which had blood on it. All this was enough to arrest James, at least temporarily, while experts examined the collected evidence. The man was taken in for questioning and asked to explain the secret room with the blood and chains. In response, James gave them another dubious story. He said he had made the room because he wanted to set up his own studio to shoot adult material, so it was just his improvised film set. Of course, the detectives didn't believe what he said. The room looked as if it had originally been made to hold people against their will. Nevertheless, they still could not connect it to Sierra's disappearance, nor could they determine her whereabouts. But that all changed on the third day after her disappearance. During a lengthy search, the police found a freshly dug grave in a field that contained Sierra's body. Her hands were handcuffed, and the young woman had a large plastic toy in her mouth. She was also wearing an adult diaper. Medical examiners determined that the victim died from strangulation, but they were unable to determine even the approximate time of death. In addition, they did not find any signs of violence. Around the same time, forensic scientists were actively examining all the evidence collected from James' barn. They found female DNA on one of the pieces of duct tape lying next to the mattress, and it matched Sierra's DNA. The cops also obtained geolocation data on James' smartphone. It turned out that on the night of the young woman's disappearance, he had spent almost 2 hours near that location. They received another disturbing piece of evidence from the psychologist James had court appointed for a previous abduction. According to him, during one of his sessions, James stated that he was learning from his mistakes with each new abduction and that next time he was going to bury the bodies. Apparently, the psychologist decided not to inform the police of such disturbing statements made by his client and did so only after he had been accused of murder. With this set of clues, the detectives formed the most likely chronology of events. Apparently, James spotted Sierra on the road that night, hit her with his helmet, and dragged her into a field with his bicycle. Based on his geolocation data, the man sat there until the sun went down. During that time, he called his brother and told him that his motorcycle had broken down. Apparently, this was his way of creating an alibi. As soon as it got dark outside, James drove home, got off his motorcycle onto his van, and returned to the field, picked up Sierra, and took her to his barn. At that point, the young woman was either unconscious or restrained. What happened next only James knew. He apparently abused the victim for some time before killing her and burying her in a field. Experts only speculated that the victim may have been there for 3 days. The man himself continued to deny all of these allegations, and the case went to trial. The trial began in March 2018 with the prosecution presenting additional evidence that further pointed to his guilt. It turned out that the key to the handcuffs placed on the victim's hands was found on James' keychain. His lawyers decided to stick with the theory that James simply wanted to set up an adult film studio in his barn, and the cops pulled that into the murder. However, they did not provide any adequate arguments for their client's innocence. The trial ended in less than a month, and on March 28th, the jury found him guilty. As a result, James received the death penalty, his execution scheduled for May 20th, 2025. Of course, this story was far from over for the detectives. Given everything they had learned about the man, the police were certain that James had committed similar crimes before, but he had managed to avoid responsibility. Investigators were still working on his case, trying to tie the unsolved disappearances to James, but it had yet to yield concrete results. The victim's parents established the Sierra Scholarship and also participated in the creation of a bill that would have required the state to make an open registry of people previously convicted of murder and kidnapping. The bill was quickly supported and went into effect on March 20th, 2019. Brittany Gregory was born on April 1, 1988, in Brick Township, in a large family, as the youngest of 5 children. After her parents' divorce, Brittany and her older sister Brianna stayed with their father Joe Dunn, but they continued to maintain close relationships with their brothers and mother, Deborah. Brittany was very intelligent, beautiful, excelled in school, and dreamed of studying criminology after graduation. She was passionate about watching various detective shows, read many books about her future profession, yet she remained an ordinary teenage girl who loved music, dancing, and hanging out with friends. In 2004, 16-year-old Brittany and her older sister Brianna, who was then 20, lived in a small house with their father Joe and his new girlfriend Lori Peterson. Their father's house was close to the school Brittany attended and was situated at the end of the street, bordered by a small wooded area. At that time, Brittany had been dating an 18-year-old boy named John Fitzgerald for 2 years. The young couple had a very good relationship, and the boy was well liked by the girl's family. On Sunday, July 11, 2004, Deborah and Brianna went to the town of Toms River, located 15 miles from Brick Township, to visit their older son and his wife, who had recently had a baby girl. That same evening, around 8:30 p.m., Brittany called her mother asking for a ride to her boyfriend's house. Her voice sounded very distressed, and her mother immediately sensed that something had happened. Promising her daughter that as soon as they returned home in about an hour, she would take her wherever she needed to go, Brittany agreed and promised to wait for her mother and sister. About 45 minutes after the call, Brianna and her mother returned to the town and tried to contact Brittany, but she didn't answer the phone. They assumed that Brittany had probably already fallen asleep and didn't wait for them. When Brianna returned the next morning, she found that Brittany wasn't home, and it appeared she hadn't spent the night there. All of Brittany's belongings, including her phone, money, and documents, were in place. Brianna suspected that her sister might have spent the night at her boyfriend's house, but this seemed strange as Brittany hadn't informed anyone. Plus, she left her mobile phone, which was very unlike her. Extremely worried, Brianna called all of her sister's friends and acquaintances, but no one had seen or knew anything. She also called her sister's boyfriend, John, who said that the last time he talked to Brittany on the phone was Sunday morning, and they hadn't seen each other since then. Lori Peterson, their father's girlfriend who lived with them, mentioned that when she returned home around 10 p.m., she discovered that Brittany wasn't there. Realizing that something was wrong, Brianna immediately went to the police to report her sister's disappearance. On July 12, 2004, after much persuasion, the police finally accepted the report on Brittany's disappearance, although they believed that the girl had most likely just run away from home or was spending time somewhere with friends. However, Brianna insisted that such behavior was not typical of her sister. She couldn't have just left home without reason, as she was devoted to her studies, spent most of her free time at the library, and never left home without notice. Brianna also informed the police that all of her sister's belongings, money, and phone were left at home. She had already contacted all possible friends of her sister, but no one knew anything about her whereabouts. Commencing the investigation, the police first arrived at Brittany's residence, inspected her room, and tried to find any clues. After examining Brittany's bag and her phone left in her room, they found nothing suspicious. They questioned everyone residing in the house and ruled out the possibility of anyone close to Brittany being involved in her disappearance. The police then moved to search the area surrounding the house. They checked neighboring houses in the area, inspected the surrounding areas, interviewed neighbors, attempting to find witnesses who might have noticed something, but none of the neighbors had seen anything suspicious. The police noted that the house was located at the end of the street, with a wooded area across the road, which they also thoroughly searched, yet found nothing suspicious. The police conducted numerous interviews with the girl's relatives, neighbors, teachers, but no one could provide any new information to the investigators. During a subsequent witness interview, Brianna told the police that shortly before Brittany's disappearance, she had a fight with her boyfriend, John Fitzgerald, as she saw him kissing another girl. Nevertheless, Brittany decided to forgive him for this incident and wanted to reconcile with him. The police became interested in this information and invited John Fitzgerald to the police station for questioning. John was genuinely shocked by Brittany's disappearance and explained that the last time he spoke to her was a previous evening when she wanted to come over, but they argued again, and she hung up. He revealed that rumors about Brittany kissing another guy at a party had caused their argument, although John himself hadn't witnessed it. Due to this, he decided to end their relationship and started dating another girl. John also mentioned that Brittany handed him a letter expressing her desire to reconcile. In the letter, she regretted breaking John's heart, apologized for her behavior, and asked to remain friends. Additionally, John told the detectives an interesting detail that intrigued the investigators. Brittany often used to come to his house through the woods that started right behind her father's house. There were no clues linking John to the girl's disappearance, and after successfully passing a polygraph test, he was eliminated as a suspect and released. Continuing their investigation, detectives decided to verify the information provided by Brittany's boyfriend and spent 3 days combing through the woods adjacent to her home, but, to their great disappointment, found nothing. At this stage, the investigation hit another dead end, and the police had no leads other than the possibility that the girl might have decided to take her life amidst the argument with her boyfriend. However, Brittany's relatives were outraged by this assumption as she loved life, was ambitious, aimed to build a career, and no argument with her boyfriend could have diverted her from her path to the extent of taking her own life. Just when it seemed the investigation had come to a halt, a woman approached the police. She, while walking in the park in the same area with her brother on the night of Brittany's disappearance, noticed a passing car, a Chevrolet pickup. The woman even remembered the vehicle's license plate number. Upon checking this information, investigators determined that the car was registered under the name of a 23-year-old Anthony Geiger. The police decided to delve deeper into Anthony's past and found out that he had previously dated Bobby Jo, another sister of Brittany. When questioned about this, Bobby Jo revealed that they had broken up about a month ago because she believed Anthony had developed strong feelings for her younger sister and was paying her too much attention. She decided to cut off all ties with him. Brittany's friends corroborated Bobby Jo's account, mentioning that Anthony always seemed to look at her strangely and tried to flirt with her. Detectives speculated that Anthony might be involved in Brittany's disappearance and summoned him for questioning. During the interrogation, Anthony denied being in the area on the evening of July 11. According to him, he was there on July 12, by which time the police had already begun searching for the girl. He didn't deny having a good relationship with Brittany, frequently meeting her at parties with mutual friends, but he also denied showing any excessive interest in her. He claimed they were just friends, additionally stating that she was too young for him and he only saw her as a friend. According to Anthony's testimony, on the evening of July 11, he had an alibi. He claimed to have spent it at his place with his new girlfriend. Despite this girlfriend confirming Anthony's alibi, investigators still considered him a suspect due to his residence being close to Brittany's home. After the investigation once again reached a standstill, the police turned to the media, spreading information about the girl's disappearance. Moreover, detectives from neighboring districts were brought in to assist with the investigation. Brittany's family also actively participated in the search efforts, posting flyers in public places, visiting neighbors' homes, and questioning them. hoping someone might have seen or heard something, but initially this led to no avail. Unfortunately, such efforts didn't yield any results. No one had seen or heard anything relevant. At a certain point, the police began to consider the possibility that the girl might have been abducted from her own home. They conducted a thorough search at Brittany's house and discovered her personal diary in her room. The contents of these entries were crucial to the investigation, as they shed light on the secrets surrounding the girl's family. In Brittany's diary, she detailed her life, relationships with friends and her boyfriend, as well as her school life. A significant part of the diary contained information about her family. She wrote that every Sunday she visited her older brother who was in prison, that her mother left her when she was 9 years old and her father struggled with addiction, and she was forced to live with him and his girlfriend in the same house. Upon studying the girl's diary, detectives expanded the list of suspects and focused their attention on Brittany's father, Joe Dunn, who had a long history of drug use and had numerous acquaintances, including suspicious individuals who frequently entered and exited the house. They also discovered that his girlfriend, Lori Peterson, ran a male massage parlor within the house where different men were serviced daily. However, it was revealed that she not only provided massages, but also engaged in intimate services for money. Lori wasn't secretive about this fact and even distributed her business cards to neighbors in the area. The police theorized that considering the unfavorable environment present in Brittany's home, it was plausible that someone visiting the house could have abducted the girl. Over 100 officers were dedicated to identifying everyone who had visited Joe Dunn's house in the last month. A meticulous investigation ensued, and on July 18, a week after Brittany went missing, the police announced the arrest of a murder suspect. The Brittany family was shaken by this news, as they believed her to be missing and her body had not been found. When Brittany's mother, Deborah, saw the televised photo of the suspect, she immediately recognized him. It was their longtime family acquaintance, 38-year-old Jack Fuller. They had been friends for about 20 years. His daughter was engaged to Brittany's brother, who was in prison. Deborah couldn't believe that he had abducted Brittany. Soon after Fuller's arrest, the police disclosed a portion of the information that led to his detention. It all started with a call to the police station from an informant whose identity was not revealed. The caller reported that a few days earlier, Jack Fuller had complained to him about back pain, supposedly arising after he buried the girl's body. Jack assured the man that the location where he had hidden the body would never be discovered. His only concern was how deeply he should bury the body to prevent animals from detecting it. The detectives needed more information for Fuller's arrest, so they decided to conduct a secret operation known as the Sting Operation. They equipped the informant with a listening device, and during a meeting with Jack Fuller, he attempted to inquire about his crimes, including Brittany's murder. Without hesitation, Fuller revealed to him that he buried the girl's body deep in the woods where nobody would find it, but he never mentioned Brittany's name. Furthermore, Fuller stated that he needed to eliminate a witness who knew too much about the incident, pointing to his friend Tommy Long, who was present in the car during the meeting and didn't hear those words. Hoping that Tommy possessed crucial information about the incident, investigators apprehended him and brought him in for questioning. Initially, he refused to cooperate, claiming he knew nothing. However, the police allowed him to listen to the conversation with Jack where Jack planned to kill Tommy. Realizing the danger he was in, Tommy revealed that on the night Brittany disappeared, he and Jack were cruising around and stopped by Brittany's father's place. Jack went inside, but it turned out there was nobody home except the girl. Eventually, Jack returned to the car with Brittany, who sat in the back seat. Tommy mentioned that he didn't understand what was happening and only asked, "What's going on?" Brittany didn't respond, and Jack said he dropped Tommy off at home. He claimed that Jack dropped him off, and when he got out of the car, Brittany, who was seated in the back, moved to the front passenger seat, and they drove off. The next day, when friends met again, Jack never mentioned the incident. They went to a car wash where Jack meticulously cleaned his car inside and out, which was unusual as he had never done that before. The car wash attendant even joked about it, but Jack got very angry and warned him not to meddle in his affairs, saying the attendant was risking his life. Tommy mentioned that as soon as he learned about the girl's disappearance, he directly asked Jack about it, to which Jack got furious and said he had taken her home and then left. He menacingly forbade Tommy from asking about it again unless he wanted trouble. Tommy speculated that perhaps Jack took Brittany to the woods to take advantage of her, as that night he had expected intimate services from Lori, but she wasn't home. The detectives decided it was necessary to immediately arrest Jack Fuller. When they arrived at his house, he was holding a gasoline can and preparing to set fire to his car. Crime scene investigators thoroughly searched the vehicle and found blood, which forensic analysis identified as Brittany Gregory's. The police also confiscated a vacuum cleaner from the car wash where Jack washed his car. Upon careful examination of the vacuum contents, experts discovered sand particles with baked blood, confirming it was Brittany's blood. Despite all the evidence collected by the police, Jack did not confess to the abduction and murder of Brittany and refused to speak. Detectives interviewed all of Jack's acquaintances, most of whom believed he was capable of murder. Fuller was a genuine criminal. He constantly committed various offenses, breaking into cars and houses for theft using and distributing illegal substances, assaulting a man with a baseball bat, physically resisting police officers, and he had been repeatedly arrested for drunk driving. He had been arrested more than 12 times in the past 10 years, and just a year before the girl's disappearance, he was released from prison after serving a 5.5-year sentence. Another intriguing fact emerged during the investigation. On the night Brittany disappeared, one of the patrol officers saw a car parked by the side of the road at the edge of the forest. That was Jack Fuller's car. When the police officer approached Jack, he claimed to be searching for his dog that had run into the woods. Considering this information, the police organized extensive searches for the girl's body in the area where Jack's car was spotted, involving police personnel, canine units, helicopters, and volunteers. But unfortunately, they found nothing. While investigators tried to extract a confession from Jack Fuller, a woman called the police claiming she might know where he hid the victim's body. This woman had a less than stellar reputation. She used illegal substances and had been living with Jack for several months. During that time, she got to know him well, as he often took her to the same places. Once, he showed her a spot near a power line and said it was an excellent place to bury someone, ensuring nobody would ever find them. At first, detectives dismissed everything this woman said as fabrication, but she mentioned that the location was in Linewood, an area with sandy soil. The place was just 3 miles from Brittany's home, prompting the police to organize searches involving law enforcement from neighboring districts and K-9 units. On the morning of Tuesday, July 27, 2004, 15 days after Brittany was reported missing, 3 police officers with dogs discovered a spot with a hand protruding from the ground, bearing a bracelet with the name Brittany. Detectives realized they had finally found Brittany Gregory's body, confirmed by forensic analysis. Unfortunately, due to the body's decomposition, the examining expert couldn't determine the exact cause of her death, as there were signs of strangulation and a severe head injury. After the discovery of the girl's body, following advice from his lawyer, Jack Fuller decided to negotiate a guilty plea deal with the prosecution. On February 9, 2005, at the trial in the county court, Jack Fuller was charged with murder. During the lengthy legal process, he eventually confessed that on that night, Brittany asked him to take her to her boyfriend's house, and he agreed. Initially, he dropped off his friend Tommy at his home and planned to drive the girl to her boyfriend's, but before that, he stopped by the roadside to smoke one of his illegal substances, causing Brittany's displeasure. She started yelling at him and hit his hand. This enraged him, and he started punching the girl in the face and head. He stated that he struck her forcefully at least twice, after which Brittany began gasping and making gurgling sounds while Fuller continued, ignoring the fact that she was already bleeding from her mouth and nose. When he finally came to his senses, he saw that the girl was motionless and not breathing. Realizing that Brittany was dead, he decided to dispose of her body. On October 18, 2005, Jack Fuller officially pleaded guilty to intentionally causing grievous bodily harm resulting in death, and on January 13, 2006, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Brittany's mother and sisters didn't believe Jack's account of what happened, as they suspected he subjected her to sexual violence. They questioned why he undressed the girl before burying her, but this remained a speculation as the examination couldn't determine whether sexual violence occurred or not. In 2008, Brittany's school, Brick Memorial High School, initiated a forensic science program in memory of her. as it was something she had passionately wished for. This is the resolution of this tragic story. Who knows if Jack Fuller, who had been arrested multiple times for various crimes, had been in prison, perhaps Brittany would still be alive. Tara Grinstead was born in 1974 in Hawkinsville, USA. During her high school years, she actively participated in beauty contests, winning prizes. The girl from an early age set a goal to get a quality education. So the money earned in competitions, she put aside to pay for her education. After college, Tara earned a master's degree in education and landed the job she had long dreamed of. She became a high school history teacher in Acilla, Georgia. This tiny town was a typical low-rise America. Its population did not exceed 4,000 people, most of whom knew each other well. Life was quiet and measured. None of the locals could think that any serious crime could occur in Acilla. Tara Grinstead had worked at the local school for several years, and during that time she had developed a great relationship with both staff and students. She was a kind and outgoing person who was always supportive and helpful. In October 2005, this help came in handy for Tara's students who were preparing to participate in a local beauty pageant. Given the fact that their teacher had won prizes at similar events many times, the girls were thrilled to have her support. On Saturday, October 22nd, Tara helped the students with the final touches before the pageant. Afterward, she went to a picnic with her high school friends and didn't return home until 11 p.m., having parked her car outside under a carport. Since then, Tara had stopped making contact. Her mother, who lived in another city, was the most worried. Her daughter always picked up the phone or called back, but this time there was no answer. On Monday, October 24th, her anxiety reached its peak and Tara did not show up for work. Such behavior was highly unusual for her. The girl took her job seriously and would certainly have warned her bosses that she needed time off. Concerned acquaintances of Tara called the police chief, Billy Hancock, and asked him to see if she was all right. At 10 a.m. that morning, he went to her address. The policeman thought the woman's phone was just dead and that she was either sick or had overslept. When he arrived at her house, he found Tara's car in its usual spot. Her doors were unlocked, but that didn't surprise Billy. In a town this small, the residents had no worries about their cars being stolen. Then he noticed an envelope on a dashboard containing $100 in cash. It was already strange. How could someone as responsible as Tara leave money in a prominent place? Billy knocked on the door, but no one opened it for him. After that, he decided to look around the house. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. No signs of a struggle or a break-in, but in Tara's bedroom the detective found a real mess. Quite uncharacteristic for a woman. Her belongings were on the floor, including the clothes she had last been seen in. Her cell phone was on the nightstand charging. It looked as if Tara had left the house briefly, but she was nowhere to be found. On the ground outside the house, the police found the first piece of evidence that suggested a possible crime. There was a latex glove lying around that someone might have used to conceal her fingerprints. The detectives did not consider the possibility that the glove might have belonged to Tara. Hardly anyone used such gloves in the home. Since then, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the equivalent of the FBI, only at the level of one state, got involved in the case. The main version of the investigation was kidnapping. There was very little evidence. Besides the glove, the detectives found only two questionable things. Tara's torn chain was lying on the bedroom floor, and her alarm clock was not in its usual place. But all this did not help detectives solve the mystery of her disappearance. For the small town, this Monday was truly a terrible day. Tara's house was cordoned off, and the school had a meeting. Tara's co-workers and students tried their best to help in the search by forming a group of volunteers. They printed out a stack of flyers with the woman's picture and informed about her disappearance. And within hours, the flyers were posted all over the city. Volunteers stayed home that day until 1 a.m. Agents from the Bureau of Investigation interviewed Tara's neighbors and investigated the neighborhood in which she lived. The search involved sniffer dogs, which had been brought in the hope of picking up the missing person's trail. Investigators still had hope that Tara had simply left on foot and the dogs would find her easily. In the meantime, the latex glove was given to experts whose goal was to collect as much data as possible. They managed to get a DNA sample, but no matches could be found in the FBI database. All that was known was that the sample belonged to a man. Alas, all this yielded no results. Tara, as if she had evaporated from her own home. Then investigators began to dig into Tara's personal life and past. It often happens that when a woman disappears, someone from her inner circle is to blame. After studying the man with whom Tara was in a relationship, detectives were unable to identify any suspects. She dated Marcus Harper, a former policeman and military officer, for the longest time. The couple broke up at Tara's initiative about a year before she disappeared. The reason was that the woman wanted to build a family and Marcus was not ready for that. After the breakup, they maintained an amicable relationship, calling and texting each other. Detectives later uncovered one interesting detail. Marcus had come to Osceola 3 weeks before Tara disappeared, but he had not told her. Upon learning of Marcus's arrival from mutual acquaintances, the woman became very upset. She repeatedly called him, trying to find out why he had not informed her of his arrival. Soon Tara's condition turned into a real hysteria. Her relatives were very worried and even wondered if Tara was going to do something reckless. However, the girl soon came to her senses, and the police did not consider Marcus a suspect. The couple had been together for a long time, but their relationship ended and the detectives could not find a motive for the crime. An interesting twist soon awaited them. Police learned that Tara had been threatened by her former student. On March 30 of 2005, 7 months before the girl disappeared, he came to her house and behaved extremely aggressively. When Tara refused to let him in, the guy started banging on the door and the neighbors had to call the police. It turned out that the young man had been in love with the teacher since high school. According to her acquaintances, the former student was emotionally unstable and behaved strangely and even frighteningly. Tara tried to help him deal with his problems for a while, but his mental state only worsened. After that incident, when the young man tried to break into her house, the woman filed a report against him. She seriously feared he might hurt her. After Tara went missing, the police tracked the young man down. He worked in a neighboring town about 150 kilometers from Osceola. The boy provided detectives with an alibi for the night of his former teacher's disappearance. It was impossible to establish his involvement in the case. A business card of a certain police officer was also found in the woman's house. It turned out that Tara had been dating him for some time. But at the time of her disappearance, he was already living in another city. The policeman also provided an alibi for the night of Tara's disappearance. This effectively ended the list of possible suspects. With no leads in hand, the police decided to organize a search for the girl 2 weeks after her disappearance. Such a belated decision seems strange. After all, it was clear of the first minutes Tara had not left home of her own free will. Hundreds of volunteers were called in to search the area around Osceola. Volunteers went through forests, ditches, and rivers, but they couldn't find a single trace of Tara. During the search, it was reported that a house and car had burned down near Tara's home. Locals almost unanimously agreed that the incident had something to do with the woman's disappearance. Perhaps the perpetrator was trying to cover his tracks, or the people were so shocked and frightened that they found each event suspicious. Whatever the case, the search yielded no results, and the police were faced with a grim reality. They simply had no leads left. The next few years brought the police no closer to solving this mystery. It wasn't until 2009 that an event occurred that brought the missing Tara Grinstead back into the spotlight. A user created a YouTube channel and posted an extremely creepy video. A man was sitting in the frame, his face plastered over and his voice altered. In the video, he claimed to be involved in the disappearance of 16 girls, naming them by name. Among them was Tara Grinstead. The unidentified man added that he had hidden the bodies securely and would give clues about the burial site in new videos. Police immediately checked the video and found that all 16 names did indeed belong to the missing women. The FBI was able to track down the author of the video fairly quickly. It turned out to be 27-year-old Andrew Haley. After his arrest, he said that he was just joking. The police could not connect Andrew with any of the 16 missing girls, but he still could not avoid a trial. For perjury and tampering with evidence, the man was sentenced to 2 years of forced labor and 13 years of probation. Momentary hopes of solving this cold case faded, and once again the police were left without a single lead. In December 2010, Tara Grinstead was officially declared dead because there was simply nothing to work with. As the years passed, the townspeople remembered Tara Grinstead's disappearance perfectly. Remembered, but less and less discussed. Talk of Tara remained only behind closed doors. The topic hardly ever came up in everyday life. The town had changed forever. Fear and mistrust permeated the locals for years to come. It wasn't until 2016 that something happened that got people talking openly about Tara again. Atlanta-based journalist Payne Lindsay created his own podcast devoted to mystery cases. And for the first issue, he took on the Tara Grinstead case. The man and his colleague traveled to Wasilla, where they met private investigator Maurice Goodwin. Together, they began working on the case literally from scratch. They had no access to police records, so the only available source of information were the people of the town. At first, they were only able to talk to friends and relatives of Tara. Outsiders avoided talking about the missing girl in every way, but it didn't last long. Lindsay's enthusiasm managed to revive interest in the case, and soon the people of Wasilla were discussing it again. Lindsay and Godwin worked through every possible lead. They considered 3 possible suspects: Tara's ex-boyfriends and the student who tried to break into her house. Along the way, they talked to anyone who might have any useful information. They were so passionate about the case that on several occasions they thought a clue was literally one step away. One day, Payne received a call in which an unknown person suggested they look for remains on Tara's property. The police did so, and at some point they managed to find the bones. True, experts quickly determined that the bones belonged to an animal. Despite the excitement and a new wave of interest in the case, no serious progress was made. Or rather, they failed to solve the case directly during the creation of the podcast, but it was this amateur investigation that was decisive in the long-awaited denouement, and the denouement came completely unexpectedly. In early 2017, Brooke Sheridan came to the police. Her story shocked the detectives, who no longer believed that the truth would ever come out. Brooke told investigators that her ex-boyfriend named Bo Dukes once confessed to her. He had helped his friend dispose of Tara Grinstead's body. Upon learning of this, the girl repeatedly begged the guy to confess to everything, but he remained silent. After listening to Brooke's story, the police did not rush things. Who knows, maybe this woman just wanted fame and attention, especially when a successful podcast got everyone talking about the case again. The detectives decided to play it safe. They asked Brooke to wear a wire and go to Bo to beat out a confession, and it worked. The man didn't deny his involvement, and the police had probable cause to arrest him. To their surprise, O immediately cooperated with the investigation and laid all his cards on the table. Later, Detectives would say that he was just tired of living with this burden on his soul. Late that night, he got a call from his friend and former classmate Ryan Duke. He asked to borrow a truck to help him with something, then added, "I broke into Tara Grinstead's house to steal some money, but something didn't go according to plan and I killed her." According to Ryan's story, after a party with friends, he went for a drive. At this point, he decided to break into someone's house to steal money, and his choice was Tara's house. He was under the influence of illegal substances at the time. After opening the door with a credit card, he broke into the house and began looking for money. Tara spotted him and a struggle ensued between them, from which only Ryan came out alive. When Bo arrived at Tara's house in a truck, they loaded the woman's body into it and drove her into the woods. The two of them then got rid of the body for several days. This story shocked the residents of Wasilla. Jukes and Duke were never considered suspects, for they simply had no motive, nor were there any clues that could link these two to the disappearance of the woman. Despite a full confession, O. Dukes would not testify against himself in court. At the trial, he spoke to Tara's relatives, wept, and apologized for what he had done. Bo spent a long time in the military, was a veteran, and had many decorations, but the court ruled 25 years in prison for helping cover up a crime. Tara Grinstead's murder trial by Ryan Duke was set for April 1st, 2019, but the Georgia Supreme Court postponed the trial on March 28, 2019, after Duke's attorneys said they were unconstitutionally denied funding for experts to testify on Duke's behalf. The trial began on May 9, 2022. At trial, Ryan Duke pleaded not guilty to murder and charged Bo Dukes with murder. On May 20, 2022, a jury found Ryan Duke not guilty of murder, aggravated assault, and burglary, but guilty of concealment of death. At trial, Duke testified that his confessions to the murder was false, telling the jury that he had done it under the influence of drugs and in fear of the real killer, his friend with a similar last name, Dukes. He said Bo Dukes woke him up in the mobile home where they lived together in 2005 and told him he had killed Tara Grinstead, then showed Dukes their teacher's purse and wallet. Although her body was never found, investigators matched Grinstead's DNA to bone fragments found at the location where Ryan Duke testified to investigators that he and Bo Dukes had burned her. On May 23, 2022, Ryan Duke was sentenced by the Rowan County Superior Court to 10 years in prison for concealing the body. The sentence imposed by the judge was the maximum penalty allowed. By the time Ryan Duke was sentenced, he had already served about half of that sentence while awaiting trial. Prosecutors insisted that Duke's confession included details that only the killer knew, such as Duke telling investigators that he called Grinstead's home from a payphone after running away from home to see if she would answer. When she didn't, he returned and found her dead. Investigators also found Duke's DNA on a latex glove, found in Grinstead's yard. However, his testimony raised enough doubt in a jury's mind that he was acquitted of all charges except concealing her death. O. Dukes was subpoenaed to testify, but refused to answer the court's questions, citing his Fifth Amendment right against testifying against himself. When the truth about his high-profile case came out, Tara Grinstead's friends and relatives relieved themselves of the burden of obscurity. Her mother confessed that all these years she had secretly hoped for a miracle that her daughter would return to her alive. Alas, reality turned out to be cruel, senseless, and devoid of any miracles. At least now the whole world knows exactly what happened in that little town back in 2005. This story began in the sunny American state of Hawaii. In early 1977, a young couple, 26-year-old Mark Barnes and 31-year-old Charlotte Moriarty, had a son named Marks. It seemed that a happy and carefree future awaited the family among palm trees, sunshine, and boundless ocean. Mark worked as a veterinarian and Charlotte was an artist. The couple wasn't married, which didn't stop them from loving their child and giving him the best of everything. Before meeting Mark, Charlotte had been married and had a daughter who stayed to live with her father in New Mexico. After the divorce, her mother kept in contact with her and tried to visit her whenever possible. Fast forward to June 21st, 1977. On that day, Mark had been working on the property since early in the morning, and the man was planting Charlotte's favorite flowers around it. The girl told him she wanted to walk to the store, so as not to distract Mark from his work, she decided to take her son with her, put him in the stroller, and left. A few hours passed. Mark was so worked up that he didn't immediately realize Charlotte should have been back by now, since the store was only a few blocks away. After waiting a few more hours, he decided to walk to that store in hopes of meeting Charlotte on the way. As he stepped away from the house, he saw his son's empty stroller standing near the bus stop. Neither the child nor Charlotte was anywhere to be found. It would seem that he should have gone to the police immediately after that, but Mark didn't. As he explained later, Charlotte could sometimes go somewhere for a few days unannounced and then return home. The man decided that this time would be no exception. It sounds strange enough that if Charlotte had gone out alone, Mark's logic could still be understood. But she had taken her 6-month-old baby with her, abandoned the stroller in the middle of the street, and seemed to have vanished. 2 days passed, but Charlotte never showed up. Then Mark decided to call the police, and they advised him to wait a few more days. What if the girl and the baby still returned home? So he did, and 2 days later, he called the police again. This time he was asked for a description of Charlotte and the child, and then they promised to start a search. But after that call, no one contacted Mark, and the fate of his girlfriend and son remained a mystery. 3 weeks passed. Mark decided to go to the police station to see how the search was going, and here the strangeness continued. There he was told that no calls had been received from him. The police allegedly couldn't find any evidence that Mark, over the phone, had told them about the missing girl and child. Of course, no case was open and no one was looking for the missing all this time. Let's dwell on this point in more detail. Mark assured everyone that he had called the police twice. The police said that every call was registered and that there had simply been no calls. It is unclear which of them is right, but both scenarios are plausible. If the police really did refuse to start looking for the 6-month-old, they could have been in serious trouble. Missing small children obliged the police to search immediately, even if only a few hours have passed since the disappearance. So in this case, the police may well have covered up the fact that they did not search for the infant. The father's behavior also seems strange. Why did he wait several days before calling the police? And were there any such calls? Even if he did call, why did he wait 3 more weeks after those calls and only then decide to go to the station? After all, in all that time, he had not even called there to find out anything about the progress of the investigation. In his conversation with the detectives, Mark reported that Charlotte might have some kind of mental health problem. In the 70s, psychiatry was still gaining ground, so no treatment had been given to the girl. Neither she nor Mark even went to the hospital, even though there were very serious reasons to do so. According to Mark, Charlotte walked around the house for the first few weeks after giving birth with only a blindfold on and couldn't properly explain why. Given that there couldn't possibly be a logical explanation here, Mark was worried beyond belief and was already thinking about seeing doctors. But then Charlotte removed the blindfold and began to behave completely normally. The man decided to forget the story and not to pay any attention to it. That Charlotte's disappearance could be related to mental problems was indirectly suggested by another fact. Mark said that her daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, was going to fly to Hawaii in June to visit her mother. Charlotte was looking forward to that meeting, but at the last minute the girl's father canceled all plans and told Charlotte that they will not come this summer. This very much upset the girl, and mental disorders can be provoked by strong negative emotions that Charlotte experienced. Even in the quietest stages of a life, a person does not show any signs of unstable psyche. But all these theories did not bring the police any closer to finding the girl and her son. They opened a case, posted flyers all over the place, and couldn't find a single clue. Mark later recounted that for a year and a half after Charlotte and his son disappeared, he became obsessed with searching for them. He drove all over the island, hoping to find them alive and unharmed, but it never happened. 2 years after they went missing, he moved to California. Nor did the police have much hope in the case. Given the complete lack of evidence, no one believed that the girl and child could be found. Compounding the situation was the fact that crucial time for the search had been lost in the first few days. 24 years had passed. Mark had started a new family, and he had 2 daughters. He had long ago stopped believing that he would one day see Charlotte and Mark alive. But in 2001, the case took a new turn. Charlotte's daughter from her first marriage, Jennifer, flew to Hawaii and went to the police station. She convinced them to reopen the case of her mother's disappearance. The detectives agreed, put Charlotte and Mark's information into the missing persons database, and created a computer portrait of Mark's growing up based on his childhood photo. The first thing the detectives decided to do was to interrogate Mark because his behavior in the early stages of the investigation seemed strange to them. There was no mention in the old documents that the man had called the police station by phone 2 days after the girl and child disappeared. It said he did not come to the police station until 3 weeks later. This led detectives to believe that Mark may have been involved in their disappearance. Even though 24 years had passed since then, the police tried to find any witnesses who lived near Mark and Charlotte's home. Of course, most of the residents had already changed, but the detectives were lucky enough to find one senior citizen who had lived there back then. He remembered Mark and Charlotte and told the detectives an interesting fact. According to the pensioner, the couple often quarreled, and he heard them shouting. The detectives then decided that the case was getting close to a solution and Mark was indeed guilty. He was called in for questioning and told about the witness who had heard his regular arguments with Charlotte. Mark did not deny that there had indeed been verbal altercations between them. He also asked to see a married couple who would never fight. Detectives tried with all their might to prove his guilt and offered Mark to voluntarily undergo an interrogation with a polygraph. The results were ambiguous. The specialist who read the testimony could not give a clear answer whether the man was guilty or not. A polygraph is inherently an overrated instrument. It is not physically capable of showing whether a suspect is lying or not. Dozens of factors can affect its results. Lies can be mistaken for the truth and vice versa. If an innocent person is very nervous during an interrogation or withholds completely different information that is relevant to the questions, the polygraph can make him out to be a liar. In Mark's case, the polygraph was of no use either, but the detectives decided to go at it from a different angle. They obtained a warrant to examine the house where Charlotte and Mark lived in 1977. What interested them the most was the terrace, built shortly after the girl and child went missing. They speculated that Charlotte might not have gone anywhere that day, but might have been hurt by her husband in another quarrel and ended up in the ground under the terrace. It is not clear how the police imagined the events of that day and how an infant fits into the story, but they had no other versions. Forensics dug through the backyard and examined the terrace, but they were unable to find any trace of anyone's remains there. It is not known if they compensated the new owners of the house for the 2 days of digging in the backyard. The detectives admitted they had nothing else to work with and set the case aside again. As the last resort, they took DNA samples from Jennifer and Mark, hoping it would someday help. The case went to a long drawer again for a full 10 years. But after that time came the grand finale to this whole tangled story. Steve Carter, 35 of Philadelphia, had wondered about his past from an early age. He grew up in an orphanage, and at the age of 4, he was installed by a wealthy New Jersey couple. The U.S. Army officer and his wife loved the baby and cared for him as their own. Steve also loved his foster parents, but he always wondered how he ended up in the orphanage. In 2011, he stumbled upon an internet article that told the amazing story of Caroline White, who had been kidnapped from the hospital when she was just 19 days old. Decades later, Caroline was browsing missing children's websites, found her childhood photo there, and realized with horror that it was her current parents who had kidnapped her from the hospital. Steve Carter was inspired by the story and began researching the same sites. He entered his birth information on his certificate and was immediately speechless. The first result showed an adult photo of him taken by artists based on a baby picture. The resemblance was so strong that Carter could not even move in shock. He realized he was the same Max Barnes who had gone missing in Hawaii with his birth mother. After recovering from his shock, Steve made the decision to take a DNA test, taking the opportunity through a missing child search service. Their database contained DNA samples of Mark and Jennifer taken by the police 10 years earlier. After 8 months of waiting, the test showed an exact match. Steve Carter turned out to be Mark Barnsom. Police instantly reopened the investigation. The missing infant found himself 34 years later, but the circumstances of his disappearance were still a mystery, but not for long. His birth certificate helped solve the mystery. First, the certificate was not issued until a year after the birth of the child. Second, his name was Tenzin Amiya and his mother's name was Jane Amiya. That's what helped the police to connect the two key strands, because that name had already appeared in the reports. Not long after Charlotte and the child disappeared, the police received a strange call. A woman reported that a girl with an infant baby had knocked on the door in her house and asked for milk to feed her. The police arrived on the scene, believing that the girl was in an inadequate state. She was taken to a psychiatric clinic for evaluation, and the infant was handed over to the guardianship authorities. This girl was Charlotte. After a few days in the hospital, she secretly escaped and was never seen again, and the child remained in the care of the state, because he did not even have a birth certificate and it was impossible to identify his relatives. When the truth came out, everyone had a legitimate question: why the police did not compare the disappearance of the girl and the baby to another situation, especially when the infant was left in the care of the state. Couldn't they have realized that they had the very same child in front of them? Now, 34 years later, it's hard to answer that question. Perhaps the police simply didn't know about the disappearance because the two cases were handled by two different precincts. Steve, who by then was working in a prestigious job and had a family of his own, decided to make contact with his half-sister and biological father. They were shocked when the man revealed his own disappearance. No one believed anymore that the infant might still be alive. Although we don't know what happened to Charlotte, the ending of this story can definitely be considered happy. Sad statistics tell us that the chances of finding missing children after so many years are zero. But the case of Mark Barnes was one of the rare exceptions. He grew up in a wonderful family, received a good upbringing, and became a successful man. Most likely, Charlotte was indeed suffering from a serious mental disorder. She knocked on the door of a stranger, asking for milk to feed her son. Perhaps the call to the police saved the infant's life. Who knows how Charlotte's mental state would have changed in the future? It is still unknown what happened to her, and it is unlikely that the mystery will ever be solved. Considering that she never tried to contact her husband or find her son, the woman could have died a short time after escaping from the asylum. Perhaps timely medical care could have changed the girl's condition for the better, and this whole story would have never happened. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Sally Ann Bowman was born on September 11, 1987 in London. She grew up in a large family with 3 older sisters. Her parents, Linda and Paul, later divorced, but the girl continued to maintain a good relationship with her father. Sally was a cheerful and friendly girl with a big heart. At the same time, she was also very responsible. Already in her teens, she got a job and came to live in rented housing. The girl did not want to depend on her parents financially, but continued to see her family regularly. Later, Sally enrolled at the prestigious London School of Performing Arts and Technology, BRIT. This institution is known for such alumni as actor Tom Holland, Adele, and Amy Winehouse. Sally dreamed of working as a model, and the fact that she was able to enroll at this school was a big step towards her cherished goal. Graduating in 2004, she spent some time working as a hairstylist and model. But in January 2005, she landed a job with a London-based model agency, Pulse Model Management. From the first months, Sally has achieved impressive success in the new work. She became the face of the popular watch brand Swatch and took part in prestigious fashion shows. As a result, by the age of 18, she had already managed to build a successful career. On Saturday, September 24, 2005, Sally went to visit her mother and spent most of the day at her home. Later, her older sister, Nicole, called her and invited her to her best friend's birthday party. Sally agreed and left her mother's house around 6 p.m. At the end, she said she loved her. At 10 p.m., the young woman met her sister and her friends at the Lloyd's Bar establishment in downtown Croydon. Surveillance footage at the bar showed Sally having a great time. The company was partying, socializing, and dancing. At about 1 a.m., Sally left the bar with her sister. They walked to her house, but the young woman didn't stay there long. On the way, she called her ex-boyfriend, Louis Sportster, and arranged to meet him in downtown Croydon. At about 2:30 a.m., she got in a cab and drove to the designated location. During the meeting, there was an argument between them. They had broken up only a few weeks earlier over mutual grievances and have been trying unsuccessfully to resolve the situation ever since. Louis decided to give her a ride home on Blenheim Crescent, and they continued to argue the entire way. The couple worked out the relationship until about 4:15 a.m., at which point Sally got out of the car and headed home. At about the same time, neighbors were awakened by an unexplained noise that changed to screaming. People ran to the windows, but there was nothing suspicious going on outside. 5 minutes later, they only saw an unknown man walking down the street. At about 6:30 a.m., one of the neighbors came out of the house and noticed something strange. From behind a nearby construction container, looked out something that he first mistook for the legs of a mannequin. But as soon as he came closer, a frightening sight awaited him. There lay the half-naked body of a dead woman. She turned out to be Sally Bowman. The police quickly arrived on the scene and sealed off the area. They were unable to find the murder weapon, but experts later found DNA on the woman's body from an unknown man. They also discovered that Sally had been stabbed at least 7 times with a sharp object and had been abused. The unknown maniac had even left several bite marks on her body. Sally's family was shattered by this news. When her mother heard a knock on the door this morning, she thought it was Sally coming home. But there were police officers on the doorstep who informed her of her daughter's murder. Hours later, Sally's mother and sister had to go to the morgue to be identified. They hoped to the last that it was all one big mistake and that Sally was really alive. It wasn't until they saw her body that they realized it was really her. Meanwhile, the police launched an investigation, and the first thing they did was run a DNA sample from the woman's body through the databases. But that didn't help them identify the perpetrator. There was also no cameras in that area, which only made the job more difficult. Investigators determined that Sally was killed just 10 feet from the door of her home. Her path from her car to the building was also very short. Her attacker must have attacked her almost immediately after she left the car. The first thing the police suspected was her ex-boyfriend, Louis. He was the last person to see Sally, and her murder occurred almost immediately after she got out of the car. Investigators also found out that the couple had often quarreled in the past. Several times it even went as far as calling the police, but no charges were ever filed. On the same day, the police tracked him down and arrested him. When questioned, he stated that he didn't even know Sally was dead until the detectives themselves told him about it. He admitted that there had indeed been an altercation between them that night, but denied any involvement in the murder. According to his version, as soon as Sally got out of the car, he drove away. The investigators were in no hurry to take the guy's word for it, because things looked really not in his favor. He spent 4 days in custody while detectives waited for the results of a DNA test. Eventually, it was discovered that his DNA did not match the sample, and Louis was released. At the same time, experts discovered another interesting detail. The DNA sample found on Sally's body appeared in a criminal case 4 years ago. In 2001, a woman called from a phone booth located in the parking lot of a convenience store. At some point, a man entered the booth, stripped naked, and committed lewd acts. He did not touch the woman and fled, but left his DNA on the floor of the booth. The victim went to the police, and a sample of the pervert's DNA was attached to the case. However, they were never able to find the perpetrator. All of this happened not too far from where Sally was killed, 2.5 kilometers away. The police realized that they were dealing with a serial pervert who had been on the loose for years. The only question was how many women had suffered at the hands of this maniac and when he would strike next. Detectives had to find him before he ruined someone else's life. It soon became clear that the police's fears were not in vain. Just an hour before Sally's murder, a woman had been attacked on a nearby street. She was walking home, talking on her cell phone. At some point, a man approached her, apologized, and immediately struck her. The woman screamed and dropped her phone. But what happened next was something the attacker clearly did not expect. A taxicab appeared on the road, and that frightened him away. He grabbed the victim's phone and fled. One creepy thing worth noting here: the person on the other end of the line, the woman was still on the line and heard everything. Even after the perpetrator took the phone and disappeared from the victim's sight, her cries for help did not become any quieter. That meant he was hiding quiet nearby. Perhaps he hoped that the cab driver would drive by and the victim would be at his disposal again. Fortunately, the driver heard the screams and stopped. He put the woman in the car and took her to the hospital. There, she called the police and told them what had happened. According to her description, the attacker was a white male, 25 to 30 years old, about 180 centimeters tall, with short, dark hair. On the basis of this data, the police compiled a sketch, which was published in the media. Alas, a large number of men fell under such a vague description, so detectives received hundreds of calls from local residents. They all said that the sketch looked like someone they knew or had seen a similar man somewhere. Each such call was checked by the police, but it yielded no results. When they realized they would not be able to find the maniac from the sketch, the investigators decided to go another way. The only lead they had was a DNA sample found on the victim's body. In addition, the detectives were sure that the perpetrator lived in the area. This was evidenced by the fact that he had also attacked a woman in a phone booth on a nearby street. As a result, the decision was made to DNA screen the entire neighborhood. Police officers were to go to every apartment and house, ask questions, and ask residents to volunteer their DNA samples. Of course, the detectives did not expect the perpetrator to give them his DNA, but it was enough to get a sample from his relatives to get them closer to catching the culprit. For example, the man may have lived with parents who are unaware of his atrocities and would willingly provide his DNA to the police. For the next 6 months, police officers went to more than 6,000 addresses, and many area residents provided their DNA samples. But the entire operation came to nothing. Despite law enforcement's efforts, experts at the lab found no matches with the perpetrator's sample. All the while, the people of Croydon were in fear, and police rounds only increased the anxiety. They all knew there was a maniac on their streets. Women were afraid to walk at night. Parents would not let their children go out. As a result, the police had to go back to the sketch since there was nothing else to work with. They contacted the woman who had been attacked by the maniac on the day of Sally's murder, as well as the victim from the phone booth. They were asked to re-describe the perpetrator's appearance, and based on this testimony, the detectives compiled an adjusted version of the sketch. The police showed it at a press conference and, for the first time, revealed some details of the crimes committed, which up to that point had been kept secret. This was done in the expectation that the citizens of Croydon would realize how dangerous maniacs walk freely on their streets and would be more careful. Alas, all this also yielded no results. The updated sketch was not much different from the previous one and was too generalized. Thousands of men who lived in the area fit it. But what happened next was something no one expected. A completely random breakthrough in the case. A man was sitting in a bar watching soccer, and after drinking heavily, he began to argue with one of the patrons, and soon their conflict turned into a scuffle on the street. Unfortunately for him, a police officer walked by as he pushed his opponent to the ground. He apprehended the attacker and took him to the police station. There, something strange began. The instigator of the conflict, Mark Dixie, 35, went into a real panic and almost cried. This was very illogical behavior since he had been arrested for a misdemeanor. Most likely, no charges would have been filed by his opponent at all, and the man was free to go home. The police found him very suspicious, but they soon had to release him on bail. Before that, they conducted the standard procedure for all detainees, taking his fingerprints and a DNA sample. 12 days passed and the detectives received a call from the lab. The experts made an unexpected announcement. Mark Dixie's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Sally's body. Investigators realized they had a dangerous maniac on their hands, but they let him go. In any case, the law would not allow them to hold him any longer, and now the police had to re-arrest the perpetrator. Unfortunately for them, Dixie escaped to Amsterdam as soon as he was released. The British authorities put out a search warrant for him, but the man successfully escaped. This went on for 3 months until something strange happened. The criminal quarreled with the owner of the apartment he was renting in Amsterdam and returned back to England. Moreover, he got a job at his previous place of work, making the work of the police much easier. On June 28, 2006, almost a year after the murder, he was finally arrested and this time charged with a whole series of serious crimes. After examining his background, police found that Mark had a very rich criminal history. He committed his first crime in 1986 when he was 16 years old. He attacked a woman with a knife, robbed her, and committed depraved acts. He was sentenced to only 6 months in prison because of his age. Each subsequent year, Mark was put on trial again for robbery and molestation. And in 1990, he was arrested for assaulting a police officer. Unfortunately, all of these times the court system was favorable to him. The man received little time and continued to commit crimes. In 1993, he moved to Australia, where he picked up where he left off. 5 years later, he broke into a young woman's home, robbed and abused her. He was then arrested for exhibitionism in a park and deported from the country in 1999. Unfortunately, in those years, the police were not yet collecting DNA samples from criminals, so Dixie's DNA from the murdered woman's body showed no matches in existing databases. The police had a lot of work to do before taking the case to court. They discovered that the night Sally was killed, Dixie was celebrating his birthday at a bar with friends on Brighton Road, a few hundred yards from her home. He argued with his girlfriend over the phone and spent the rest of the evening abusing alcohol and illegal substances. He withdrew into himself and had little contact with anyone. After the bar closed, Mark and his 2 girlfriends went to a house nearby. Waiting for them to fall asleep, the man took a knife and went outside. According to the investigation, he was the one who attacked the woman who was saved from death by a cab driver. Fearing that she would call the police, Mark left for another street. Unfortunately, that's when Sally Bowman got out of the car and headed for her door. He attacked her, abused her, and fled. Apparently, it was him walking down the street that the neighbors saw from their windows that night. After killing Sally, he went back to his apartment and quietly went to bed. Mark Dixie's trial began on February 5, 2008. He refused to admit his guilt, instead making up a really ridiculous story. According to his version, he was just walking down the street and saw Sally laying on the ground. He took advantage of the situation, abused her and left, and someone else killed the woman. Dixie claimed that he allegedly did not know the woman was dead. During the trial, a woman from Australia was also found who Dixie attacked in 1998. He abused her, stabbing her 7 times, but never punished her. The jury unanimously found Dixie guilty of Sally's murder, despite his ridiculous history. As a result, the court sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 34 years. After that, he was transferred from one prison to another several times, as each time his cellmates bullied him and tried to kill him. All this time, Mark continued to deny his involvement in the murder, and it wasn't until 2015, 10 years later, that he confessed. This did not make his situation any worse, but the police were able to prove his involvement in the other crimes. In 2017, it turned out that an innocent Dutch citizen had served 12 years in prison for an attack on 3 women in Spain, which was in fact committed by Mark Dixie. In addition, the perpetrator also voluntarily confessed to another assault, which he committed when he was 16 years old. Dixie attacked a woman in a parking lot, abused her, stole her credit cards, and set her car on fire. That same evening, he found out her home phone number, called her and began taunting the victim. The woman then moved to live in the countryside because she could not cope with her trauma. That same year, Dixie was found guilty of assaulting 2 women in Croydon, for each of which he received another life sentence. 2017 was marked by another unpleasant event. Sally's family had to exhume her remains because unknown vandals kept desecrating her grave. The family decided to cremate her and leave her ashes at home. After all of this ordeal, Sally's mother is a strong advocate for a national DNA database. In her opinion, if the government collected DNA samples of all British residents, such crimes would be solved in 24 hours instead of 9 months. In addition, the woman was certain that if the perpetrator had not left his DNA at the scene, Sally's ex-boyfriend would have gone to prison for life for a murder he did not commit. The detective leading the investigation in Sally's murder supported the idea of a DNA database, but the government rejected it. In their view, forced DNA collection would violate basic human rights. This issue is very controversial. On one hand, such a database would really help solve such crimes in a matter of hours. In addition, some criminals would not dare to commit atrocities at all, knowing that they could be identified very quickly. On the other hand, not every criminal leaves their DNA behind. Also, leaking or misusing information from such a database could really hurt law-abiding people. On January 2, 1999, in the American city of Mesa, Arizona, 2 sisters, 11-year-old Michaela and 9-year-old Kimber, were walking close to home. It was a chilly evening and was just beginning to get dark outside. Despite the height of winter, Arizona is a warm southern state. So Michaela brought her bike and rode alongside her sister. At one point, the girls thought they heard the sound of an approaching ice cream truck. They put speakers on them and turned on music to alert children to the approach of a favorite treat. The girl hurried home to ask her mother and change for ice cream, then returned to the street. However, the ice cream truck was nowhere to be found, and the girls began to wait. At some point, Kimber got cold. She told her sister that she would run inside to get a jacket and come back. When she arrived back, Michaela was no longer there. The bike was lying on the road with its wheels still spinning. Beside it lay the 2 coins the girl had prepared to buy ice cream. Kimber came home and told her mother that Michaela was missing. Neither she nor her mother had yet allowed even the thought that anything could have happened to the girl. The mother thought that Michaela had gone to a neighbor with whom the family was friendly, but the girl was not there, and the mother realized that something terrible might have happened to her daughter. Immediately thereafter, she went to the police. It is worth noting that the police response was very fast. Already, in 30 minutes, a helicopter was in the air. The law enforcers stopped all suspicious cars, bypassed the surrounding houses. That day, volunteers from the girls' school handed out and posted flyers with her picture. Those pictures would later appear in storefronts and on billboards along roads throughout Arizona. Police searched dumpsters and inspected hundreds of homes. Detective Butch Gates and Jerry Giselle were assigned to the case. The cops questioned every ice cream vendor in the state and could not establish that at least one of them was in that area at the time of the girl's disappearance. Detectives reconstructed the chronology of events and came to an eerie conclusion. The girl disappeared in just 90 seconds. That's how long Kimber had been missing. The spinning wheel on the bicycle confirmed the fact that the abduction had taken place extremely quickly. Search dogs, the help of which was used by the investigation, could not get a trace of the girl, and when they did, they took only a few steps in the direction of the road. The fact that the dog takes the mark of the person only when the missing person left on his feet, this only reinforced the main version of the police. The girl was put in a car, taken away, and it all happened in a matter of seconds. The situation was complicated by the complete lack of witnesses. Despite the fact that the girls were playing in a street filled with houses, none of the neighbors saw them that night. Later, there was information that a man tried to kidnap the 2 girls right out of school. The children were 10 and 11 years old at the time. Police checked the information for a connection to the disappearance of Michaela, who was just 11, but the kidnapping turned out to be a failed prank. There was less and less evidence, so police began working out the standard theories. When a child goes missing, parents and other relatives are always checked. Given that Michaela's mother was at home at the time of the kidnapping, investigators took on the girl's father, Darian Biggs. From the beginning, no one really believed in his involvement. Why would a father kidnap his own daughter, especially in such a way, in the middle of the street, in a short period of time when his other daughter was running home? However, it soon became clear that the man had lied about his alibi. During the first interrogation, he stated that he was at work at the time of the abduction, which turned out to be untrue. In reality, he was spending time with his mistress. What happened next was even more interesting. The man failed the polygraph questioning. His wife admitted that she knew about the cheating. Darian himself had told her about it a month before it happened. The couple thought about divorce. Despite the fake alibi, the police eventually stopped considering the father as a suspect. Even in the event of a divorce, his wife had no plans to forbid him from seeing his children. He simply had no motive. In addition, the detectives acknowledged that the lie detector results may have been influenced by the emotional state of the father, whose daughter had just been abducted. He may even have laid some of the blame on himself and thought that if he had been home with his family, the tragedy could have been avoided. Detectives also tracked Darian's movements that evening and determined that he simply would not have had time to hide Michaela. The man showed up at home very quickly after his spouse called him to report his daughter missing. Detective Giselle later stated that Michaela most likely did not know her abductor. If it had been the father, she would not have thrown the bicycle and change on the ground. The girl tried to run away from the stranger, but simply did not make it. During the investigation, police regularly had leads that led nowhere. An anonymous man called detectives and reported that Michaela's body was in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Police combed the area but found nothing. Later, they received an email from an anonymous man claiming that he was the one who had kidnapped the girl. The FBI fairly quickly traced the sender's IP address and sent a SWAT team to his home in the city of Phoenix. It turned out that the sender was a 12-year-old boy who had just decided to make a joke. Meanwhile, the police had reached a stalemate, beginning to process even the most incomprehensible theories. They combed through 35 abandoned gold mines in the county, and then even questioned nearly 500 psychics who could supposedly help the investigation. Of course, this went nowhere. One witness was found who had seen a mint-colored Jeep shortly before Michaela was kidnapped. The driver was quickly found and proved innocent. After that, the police were already desperate to find the girl because there was literally not a single clue left in front of them. This went on until September 27, 1999, when the quiet county was not shocked by another shocking event. A woman living near Biggs returned home and walked into the kitchen to find a middle-aged man with his pants unbuttoned. Without uttering a word, he jumped on the woman and began strangling and abusing her. The perpetrator then set fire to the house and left. Apparently, the attacker thought his victim was dead, but the woman survived. Her neck was broken, but she was able to reach the phone and call an ambulance. Already on her way to the hospital, she whispered to the doctors from her last breath, "Michaela Biggs, the girl who is missing. He took her. You must save her." The whole town was on its ears again. Events swirled rapidly. The police took up the case and arrested the assailant. He turned out to be D. Bullock. The man was a well-known alcoholic in the area who lived with his wife and 3 children, repaired wrecked cars, and occasionally disrupted public order. His house was only 2 blocks from Biggs. D. was one of the first to volunteer to help find Michaela and willingly let police into the house to search, but not into the trailer in the backyard. For the trailer, he demanded a warrant. Agree, this behavior is extremely bizarre. A man with a bad reputation volunteering to help find a missing girl, giving the police a look around his house without any questions, and suddenly forbidding them to look in the trailer. From then on, Bullock became the prime suspect. Even though his wife provided him with an alibi for the time Michaela was kidnapped, no one believed her story, and most likely, she was just afraid of her husband. Detectives began digging into Bullock's past and discovered that he had been tried 3 times for violence and molestation, as well as for kidnapping minors. He didn't get out of prison until 1995, and at that time, none of the neighbors had any idea what kind of monster lived next door. Several times a week, Michaela took private piano lessons from a neighbor who lived across the street from Bullock's house. This suggested that the man may have known the girl long before she disappeared. After Bullock was arrested for assaulting the woman, the police searched his house again and planned to investigate the trailer he had kept them out of earlier, but they were disappointed. The trailer had disappeared without a trace. This was a major blow to Michaela's parents. They were sure their daughter was there, alive or not, but he had disappeared and the police were unable to trace his location. Bullock was sentenced to 15.5 years in prison for the September 27, 1999 attack on the woman. He categorically denied any involvement in Michaela's disappearance. This is not surprising. For the attack on his neighbor and the atrocities he did to her, 15 years in prison would be a lenient sentence by U.S. standards. A confession to kidnapping an 11-year-old girl, on the other hand, could have landed him straight in the electric chair. The parents could not accept that their only hope for the truth was gone. The mother and father wrote Bullock a letter directly to the prison, asking the ultimate question, whether he had anything to do with Michaela's disappearance. No one hoped to get a confession, but the criminal's answer took the parents by surprise. He wrote that the conversation was too personal and suggested that her parents visit him in prison. At that moment, hope rekindled in the hearts of the parents that Bullock would confess, but they were greatly disappointed. Sitting across from the perpetrator, the father asked if he had anything to do with his daughter's disappearance. Bullock simply replied that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, after which the perpetrator simply picked up and left, accompanied by security. It looked as if he was just teasing the parents, giving them false hope and destroying it by looking them in the eye. For a sadist like Bullock, the suffering of others can bring unsurpassed pleasure. This is apparently why he arranged the meeting with the grief-stricken parents. Afterwards, Michaela's father confessed that he was convinced that Bullock was involved. He stated, "I was sitting a few feet away from the guy who killed my daughter, and there was nothing I could do about it." At this point, even the most staunch hopes of solving the case were abandoned. Absolutely everyone believed that no new leads would ever emerge. Years later, they would realize that they were wrong, but more on that later. On the 5th anniversary of Michaela's disappearance, the parents buried an empty coffin, finally saying goodbye to their daughter. During this time, their marriage broke up. They changed their residence and were reluctant to contact journalists. Until 2018, the case went into a long drawer. The police simply had nothing to work with. But out of the blue, an event occurred that stirred up all of America. On March 14, 2018, a dollar bill was accidentally dropped at a police station in Mena, Wisconsin. On it was written in stubby handwriting, "My name is Michaela Biggs, kidnapped from Mass. I am alive." The bill was found by a local resident who was collecting coins and dollar bills in a jar. He was the one who came across the dollar, after which he reported the find to the police, and they instantly reopened the investigation. Michaela's mother rushed nearly 2,000 miles away to look at the handwriting and see if the message was actually written by her daughter. Other relatives also came to the station, but they all made a disappointing statement. The handwriting looked nothing like Michaela's, and the name was misspelled. The mother suggested that the bill might be someone's extremely unfortunate prank. The other relatives also supported this theory. Despite this, the police attempted to trace the bill's path. Alas, it was almost impossible to do so. Paper money changes owners so many times that it was impossible to find the author of this inscription. Experts who studied the bill suggested that the inscription was made by an adult man who was trying to imitate the handwriting of a child. Despite all this, the message on the paper bill seems highly suspicious. Could it have been someone's prank? The chance of police and relatives finding out about the bill are extremely slim. It could have been passed around for years, or it could have settled in a bank vault and no one would have noticed it. The fact that it ended up in the hands of a concerned person who reported it to the police is more of a miracle than inevitability. As for the handwriting, the most obvious version cannot be ruled out. Michaela may have written in a hurry for fear of being caught. Besides, she had been missing for 9 years before the bill appeared. Assuming someone held her captive, did they give her something to write all that time? In 9 years without practice, handwriting can change beyond recognition. There is another question no one knows the answer to. How long ago this writing was made? The bill could have been in circulation for years, or it could have appeared shortly before it was discovered. It's worth remembering about Bullock, who was supposed to be released from prison in 2017. Perhaps this evil prank is his doing. Suffice it to recall how he tormented unhappy parents by giving them false hope. Perhaps we will never know the answer to all these questions again, or this case will once again shake the world with unexpected details. Kimber, who was the last person to see her older sister before she was kidnapped, still can't forget that gruesome January night. For a long time, she blamed herself for going home to get her jacket, but now she realizes against an adult kidnapper, she would have been helpless. Kimber raises her young son, to whom she constantly talks about his Aunt Michaela. She calls her an angel who looks out for him. The girl, as well as the rest of her family, are sure that Michaela was kidnapped by Bullock, but without evidence, it can never be proved unless the criminal himself decides to confess in order to deal another blow to the missing girl's family. Do you think there's any hope that the writing on the bill was done by Michaela herself and she is still alive?